The night air beside the Nile River felt warm even after the sun had disappeared. A slow wind moved through the tall reeds near the water. Small insects drifted above the riverbank. Far away, somewhere beyond the dark fields, a dog barked once and then became quiet again. The sound faded into the heavy stillness of ancient Egypt. Most homes had already gone dark. Inside low mud brick houses, families rested on woven mats laid close together across cool floors. The smell of baked barley bread still lingered in the air from the evening meal. Clay jars stood near sleeping children. Sandals rested beside doorways coated with fine dust from the long dry day. The world had become soft and dim. Only a few oil lamps still burned. Their small flames moved gently whenever the night breeze slipped through narrow windows cut into thick walls of mud and straw. Shadows stretched slowly across the rooms. Quiet breathing filled the darkness. Tomorrow would begin before sunrise again. It always did. For farmers beside the Nile, for fishermen along the water, for scribes bent over reed paper, and for laborers carrying heavy stone beneath the heat of the desert sun, life moved according to rhythms older than memory itself. The river rose. The river fell. Children grew into workers. Workers grew tired. And silence lived inside nearly every part of life. In many homes across Egypt, children learned something very early. Before they learned numbers. Before they learned writing. Before they learned trade or farming or prayer. They learned silence. Not only quiet voices. Not only calm behavior. But deep silence. The kind that sat inside the body. The kind that lowered the eyes. The kind that taught a child to listen long before asking questions. Curiosity was not always welcomed in the ancient world. Questions could disturb order. Questions could challenge tradition. Questions could slow work. And work, in Egypt, never truly stopped. So children watched more than they spoke. And slowly, year after year, silence became part of daily life. Tonight, as the Nile moves quietly beneath the moonlight, the ancient world opens slowly around us. The night feels wide and endless. And somewhere beyond the sleeping villages, beyond the palm trees and the dark river water, a faint line of pale desert waits silently beneath the stars. In the first light of morning, workers will begin walking dusty roads again. But for now, Egypt rests. A fisherman sleeps beside rolled fishing nets that smell faintly of river mud and wet reeds. His hands are rough from years of pulling heavy ropes from dark water before dawn. His youngest son sleeps beside him, one arm across his chest, breathing slowly in the heat. In another village farther south, a woman wakes briefly during the night to stir the coals of a cooking fire that has almost gone cold. She adjusts a clay pot beside the embers and listens quietly to the breathing of her family. Outside, a donkey shifts softly in its sleep. Silence surrounds everything. Not empty silence. Living silence. The silence of tired people. The silence of routine. The silence of long labor beneath endless sun. Ancient Egypt was loud during the day. Markets filled with bargaining voices. Stone workshops rang with hammer strikes. Boatmen shouted along crowded river docks. Children ran through narrow paths between homes while bakers called customers toward fresh bread ovens glowing with heat. But beneath all those sounds lived another rule. A quieter rule. People knew when to lower their voices. They knew when to stand still. They knew when not to ask. A child sitting beside older family members during the evening meal often remained quiet unless spoken to directly. Small hands tore pieces of bread carefully while adults discussed work, taxes, river levels, or harvests. Smoke from cooking fires drifted upward toward dark ceilings blackened by years of ash. Children listened. That listening mattered deeply. In many households, obedience meant survival. Crops depended on timing. Irrigation canals required careful labor. Grain stores had to last through difficult seasons. Mistakes could bring hunger. Questions sometimes sounded too close to disagreement. And disagreement could disturb balance. The ancient Egyptians believed strongly in order. The word for this sacred balance was ma'at. It shaped religion, government, work, family life, and even personal behavior. Order kept the world steady. The Nile flooded when it should. The sun rose each morning. Workers completed their duties. Families respected elders. Silence helped protect this order. A calm child reflected a calm household. A quiet worker reflected discipline. A silent servant reflected loyalty. And so children learned early how to remain still while adults spoke around them. At sunrise, many villages slowly awakened beneath soft golden light spreading across the Nile Valley. The mornings came gently at first. Cool air moved through palm leaves. Birds stirred near the water. Thin smoke began rising from cooking fires one by one. Bakers pressed dough against hot clay ovens while sleepy workers washed dust from their faces using small bowls of river water. In narrow homes built close together, children woke beside parents and grandparents on woven mats stuffed with reeds. There was little privacy. Very little quiet space to think alone. Life happened together. Meals happened together. Labor happened together. And children learned mostly through watching. A father repairing fishing nets beside the river rarely explained each movement in long detail. His son simply sat nearby and observed. Fingers moved through rough rope carefully. Knots tightened. Floats were checked. Weights were tied in place. The child learned through silence. Questions came later, if they came at all. Along the riverbanks, boys carried water jars balanced carefully against their hips while girls swept courtyards clean of dust and straw before the heat became too strong. Goats wandered between homes. Chickens scratched at dry ground. The smell of damp mud mixed with baking grain. Everything repeated day after day. The same roads. The same fields. The same rising sun. And within repetition, curiosity often softened into routine. Not because ancient people lacked imagination. Far from it. The Egyptians dreamed deeply. They filled tomb walls with stories of gods, stars, spirits, and journeys beyond death. They watched the heavens carefully. They studied medicine, mathematics, farming, and architecture with remarkable skill. But ordinary life demanded steadiness more than questioning. Most people worked from childhood until old age beneath difficult conditions. Long hours beneath the sun left little energy for endless wondering. A farmer walking behind an ox through wet soil before sunrise thought mainly about irrigation levels, grain growth, aching muscles, and the coming heat of midday. A stone worker hauling limestone blocks thought about water, rest, and keeping pace with others. A servant inside a wealthy household thought about avoiding mistakes. Daily life itself became a teacher of silence. In one riverside village near Thebes, a young boy named Hori sat beside his older brother beneath a shaded wall while their father repaired sandals made from woven papyrus fibers. The morning air was already warming quickly. Dust floated softly across the courtyard each time someone passed along the road outside. Hori watched carefully. His father worked without speaking for long stretches of time. Fingers moved slowly through leather straps. Occasionally he dipped the material into water to soften it before tying another knot. The boy wanted to ask why some sandals lasted longer than others. He wanted to ask why wealthy officials wore softer linen while workers walked barefoot through burning dirt. He wanted to ask why the river rose some years higher than others. But he remained quiet. Not because he feared punishment. Not exactly. Silence simply felt expected. When adults spoke, children listened. When adults worked, children observed. Questions interrupted the flow of labor. And labor shaped nearly every hour of life. Around midday, the heat across Egypt often became overwhelming. The desert wind carried warmth like the breath of an enormous oven. Stone walls radiated trapped sunlight. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads while sweat darkened linen clothing. In construction sites near temples and tombs, men carried baskets filled with stone chips across narrow ramps beneath cloudless skies. Sand stuck to damp skin. Water bearers moved slowly among them, offering small relief from the crushing heat. Most workers spoke little while carrying loads. Energy needed saving. Voices faded beneath exhaustion. Even animals slowed during the hottest hours. Donkeys stood motionless in patches of shade. Dogs rested beneath carts. Birds disappeared into palm trees beside irrigation canals. The world itself seemed quieter. In these heavy hours, silence no longer felt like a rule. It felt natural. Necessary. A young servant girl carrying folded linen through a wealthy household lowered her eyes while older women discussed household accounts nearby. She moved quietly across smooth stone floors cooled by shaded walls. She had learned early not to interrupt. Inside large estates, silence carried status. Servants remained nearly invisible. They listened constantly for instructions while avoiding unnecessary speech. Many children raised in such households absorbed this behavior from the beginning. Quietness became safety. Curiosity stayed hidden inside the mind. Sometimes, during evening hours beside the Nile, curiosity found small places to breathe. After long days of labor, workers rested outside homes while cooler air slowly returned. Some repaired tools beneath fading sunlight. Others shared simple meals of bread, onions, lentils, or fish dried with salt. Children sat nearby listening to stories. Old stories moved gently through the night air. Stories about river spirits. Stories about wandering gods disguised as travelers. Stories about stars sailing across the sky in hidden boats. Questions occasionally slipped into these evenings. A child might quietly ask why the moon changed shape, or where the sun traveled after disappearing beneath the horizon. An old grandfather might answer slowly while staring toward the dark river water. But often the answers ended softly. Because mystery itself held power. Not everything required explanation. In ancient Egypt, wisdom sometimes meant accepting silence rather than breaking it. Far north along the Nile Delta, where the river spread into wide marshlands filled with birds and reeds, fishermen pushed narrow boats into shallow water before dawn. Mist drifted above the surface. The world looked pale and soft beneath fading stars. Young boys traveled with older men to learn the river. Again, learning happened mostly through watching. A father pointed toward changing currents. A hand gesture warned against hidden mudbanks. A quiet glance toward the sky measured weather. Words remained few. The river demanded attention. And attention often required silence. Hours passed with only the sounds of water against wood, distant bird calls, and nets slipping into dark currents. Some boys grew comfortable within the stillness. Others carried questions silently for years. Why did crocodiles attack some boats and not others? Why did certain prayers seem important before fishing trips? Why did some families remain poor generation after generation? Many never asked aloud. Because survival mattered more than answers. As the centuries moved forward, Egypt grew into one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. Temples rose. Cities expanded. Trade routes stretched across deserts and seas. But beneath the monuments and ceremonies, ordinary life remained deeply repetitive. Most people woke early, worked long hours, ate simple meals, and slept close together beneath warm night air. Inside schools for scribes, silence took on another form. These schools often existed near temples or government buildings. Boys training to become scribes entered a world shaped by strict discipline and endless copying of texts onto papyrus. The scratching sound of reed pens filled quiet rooms. Dust floated through narrow windows. Teachers walked slowly between rows of students seated cross-legged on woven mats. A scribe's education demanded patience more than creativity at first. Students copied words repeatedly until hand movements became smooth and controlled. Mistakes brought correction. Neatness mattered deeply. Many lessons focused not only on writing but behavior. Respect authority. Control speech. Listen carefully. A good scribe observed before speaking. Some surviving Egyptian texts even advised young men directly about silence. Calm speech reflected wisdom. Loud voices suggested foolishness. The ideal person remained measured and restrained. Curiosity existed, but disciplined curiosity. Curiosity kept inside boundaries. One afternoon in Memphis, a young apprentice named Painassi sat beside a courtyard wall covered in fading plaster while practicing symbols beneath the watch of an older instructor. Sweat rolled slowly down his neck in the afternoon heat. Flies drifted lazily through the room. His hand cramped from writing. He wanted to ask why certain symbols represented sounds while others represented whole ideas. He wanted to ask who first created writing itself. But instead he lowered his head and continued copying line after line onto rough papyrus sheets. Outside the school walls, life continued with its familiar rhythm. Merchants guided donkeys loaded with grain sacks through crowded roads. Potters shaped wet clay beside spinning wheels. Women balanced baskets atop their heads while moving between market stalls beneath linen awnings. Everywhere, labor. Everywhere, repetition. And within repetition, silence settled deeply into the structure of daily existence. Even religion encouraged quiet reflection. Inside temple courtyards, priests moved through rituals with careful precision. Incense drifted through shaded halls supported by enormous stone columns carved with sacred symbols. Footsteps echoed softly against cool floors. Ordinary people approaching temples often lowered their voices naturally. Sacred spaces invited stillness. The gods listened best in silence. At night, after long ceremonies ended and temple fires dimmed, junior priests sometimes sat alone copying sacred texts by oil lamp. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly beneath moonlight. Jackals wandered distant dunes. The air cooled slowly after brutal daytime heat. In those lonely hours, curiosity may have risen quietly inside tired minds. Questions about life. Questions about death. Questions about whether the gods truly heard every prayer whispered into darkness. But even private questions often remained unspoken. Ancient life rarely rewarded open doubt. Silence protected social harmony. Silence protected work. Silence protected peace within crowded homes and crowded cities. As generations passed, parents taught children the same lessons their own parents had taught them. Rise early. Work carefully. Respect elders. Control your voice. Do not interrupt. Listen first. Speak later. And somewhere within these lessons, curiosity learned to move softly. Not gone. Never fully gone. Only quieter. Near sunset, Egypt changed again. The brutal white light of afternoon softened into gold and amber. Long shadows stretched across fields beside irrigation canals. Farmers guided tired animals home while workers washed dust from their bodies in river water cooling beneath the evening sky. Children chased each other through village paths before darkness settled fully. Cooking fires brightened one by one. The smell of roasting fish and fresh bread drifted through warm air. Voices returned gently after the long exhausting day. Yet even during these softer hours, silence still held importance. Families often sat together simply resting after labor. No need for endless conversation. No need for constant explanation. People understood each other through routine. Through shared exhaustion. Through years lived closely together. A mother grinding grain beside a stone mill before dawn did not need to explain tiredness to her daughter watching nearby. A boat builder rubbing sore shoulders beside the river after sunset did not need to describe labor to his sons. Life itself spoke clearly enough. And so children absorbed lessons not through speeches, but through atmosphere. Through quiet observation. Through long days watching adults move carefully through difficult lives. Far beyond the green Nile Valley, the desert remained silent in another way entirely. Caravans crossing endless sand often traveled for hours hearing little except wind and footsteps. Traders wrapped cloth tightly against blowing dust while camels moved steadily beneath enormous skies. The desert taught silence harshly. There, unnecessary speech wasted moisture and strength. Travelers listened instead. To wind direction. To shifting sand. To distant animal sounds at night. Silence became awareness. Awareness became survival. And across all these landscapes, river villages, crowded cities, temple schools, desert roads, fishing boats, the same quiet pattern repeated through ancient Egyptian life. Listen first. Observe carefully. Question gently, if at all. Now the night deepens again above the Nile. Stars spread across black water. Palm leaves move softly in the darkness. Inside sleeping homes, tired workers turn slowly on woven mats while warm wind slips through narrow windows. Somewhere, a child still lies awake for a few moments longer. Listening to insects beyond the walls. Listening to distant river sounds. Wondering quietly about the enormous ancient world surrounding them. But the questions remain inside the mind. For now, silence still comes first. The hours before dawn often felt the quietest in ancient Egypt. Night insects still moved through the reeds beside the Nile, but their sounds had softened. The wind became cooler for a little while before the coming heat of morning. Across sleeping villages, cooking fires had faded into low orange embers. Thin smoke drifted upward through dark air and disappeared among the stars. Most people remained asleep. Bodies rested heavily after long labor beneath the sun. Farmers stretched across woven reed mats beside children curled beneath linen cloth. Elderly grandparents slept near doorways where cooler air passed gently through cracks in the mud brick walls. In small homes crowded with family members, breathing rose and fell together like slow river water. The silence before sunrise felt sacred to many people. Not holy in a grand or dramatic way. Simply old. Ancient. A silence that had existed long before kings built temples of stone. Along the riverbanks, fishermen were often the first to wake. One by one, dark shapes moved quietly through narrow village paths carrying rolled nets across tired shoulders. Sandals brushed softly against packed earth. A cough sounded somewhere in the darkness. A sleepy donkey shifted beside a wooden fence. Nobody spoke much. The day had not fully arrived yet, and words still felt heavy inside the cool air. A fisherman named Jadu stepped carefully around sleeping dogs while carrying a clay oil lamp toward the river. His oldest son followed behind him with folded net weights tied in rough bundles of rope. The boy was 12 years old. Old enough now to begin learning the river properly. Neither of them spoke during the walk. The son had many questions hidden inside his mind. He wondered why the river sometimes swallowed boats during storms. He wondered how his father always seemed to know where fish gathered before sunrise. He wondered why older fishermen stared so often toward the horizon in silence. But he asked nothing. Instead he listened to footsteps, to insects, to distant water moving against mud banks beneath darkness. When they reached the shore, several other boats already drifted quietly near the reeds. Men untied ropes slowly. Wooden hulls creaked softly against wet posts. Somewhere farther downriver, another fisherman whispered a short prayer toward the unseen gods before pushing away from land. The Nile itself seemed half asleep. Mist floated low above black water reflecting fading stars. The fishermen stepped carefully into their boat. The boy watched every movement closely. His father adjusted the nets without explanation. Fingers checked knots by touch alone. The oars dipped quietly into the river. Again, learning happened through silence. In Egypt, many skills passed from one generation to another without long teaching speeches. Knowledge moved through observation, through repetition, through years spent beside older hands doing the same labor every day. Children learned by remaining close. Close enough to see. Close enough to imitate. Close enough to understand slowly over time. The boat drifted farther into the current while pale light slowly gathered along the eastern horizon. Birds began waking among the reeds. The first signs of morning spread softly across the river valley. Back inside the villages, other workers also stirred from sleep. Women knelt beside stone grinding tools crushing grain into flour for the morning bread. The steady sound of grinding stones became one of the first noises heard each day in many homes across Egypt. Slow, rhythmic, almost peaceful. Nearby, small children rubbed sleep from their eyes while watching mothers mix dough with practiced hands. The smell of fresh grain rose into warm air. Clay ovens slowly heated beside walls stained dark from years of smoke. A young girl named Tia sat quietly beside her mother while helping shape small loaves of bread. She wanted to ask why some families owned servants while others worked endlessly themselves. She wanted to ask why scribes carried clean hands while laborers carried scars and swollen joints. But she remained quiet. Her mother looked tired already. The day had barely begun. Questions could wait. Perhaps forever. Outside, sunlight finally touched the tops of palm trees lining the riverbanks. The world brightened slowly into shades of gold and pale brown. Dust rose beneath early footsteps as workers moved toward fields, workshops, and river docks. The day's labor began again. In farming villages, silence often traveled beside work naturally. A farmer guiding an ox through wet soil needed attention more than conversation. Irrigation canals had to open carefully at the right moments. Young plants required protection from wandering animals. Water levels changed constantly with the moods of the Nile. Mistakes carried consequences. Entire harvests could suffer. And so workers focused quietly. The sounds of labor filled the air instead. Wood scraping against earth. Mud sucking at bare feet. Water pouring through narrow channels. Birds circling overhead. The steady breathing of animals. Children worked too. Not always through harsh commands or punishment, but because survival required many hands. Boys gathered reeds, carried water jars, and watched animals graze along canal banks. Girls swept homes, prepared grain, mended cloth, and cared for younger siblings while adults worked nearby. Childhood moved quickly in the ancient world. There was little separation between children and adult responsibility. By watching older people constantly, children absorbed behavior naturally. They learned when to lower their voices. They learned when not to interrupt exhausted adults returning from labor. They learned silence almost the same way they learned walking. A natural part of growing. Near the city of Thebes, where great temples rose beside the Nile beneath enormous stone columns, another kind of silence shaped daily life. Temple workers moved carefully through sacred spaces from early morning onward. Priests washed themselves before rituals. Young assistants swept courtyards clean of drifting sand. Scribes prepared offerings lists while incense smoke curled upward into shaded ceilings painted deep blue with golden stars. Inside these temples, sound itself felt controlled. Footsteps echoed softly. Voices remained low. The gods, many believed, existed close beside silence. A young temple servant named Becket carried jars of oil through a long hallway lined with carved stone figures. The floor beneath her feet felt cool compared to the growing heat outside. She kept her eyes lowered. Not from fear exactly. From habit. Temple life trained the body toward quietness. Even breathing sometimes felt too loud within those massive sacred halls. As she walked, Becket passed older priests discussing ritual calendars in soft measured voices. She wanted to ask why the gods demanded so many exact ceremonies. She wanted to ask whether ordinary workers exhausted from labor truly believed the gods listened to every offering. But her thoughts stayed private. Curiosity lived carefully in places like this. The temple walls themselves seemed to encourage silence. Huge carved scenes covered nearly every surface. Kings presented gifts to gods with calm perfect expressions. Sacred animals faced eternity in painted stillness. The stone figures never interrupted. They simply watched. Outside the temple complexes, cities slowly grew louder as the morning advanced. Merchants arranged goods beneath linen shades stretched across market roads. Potters shaped wet clay while wheels spun beneath practiced hands. Bronze workers hammered glowing metal inside smoky workshops where heat pressed heavily against the skin. The smell of life filled the streets. Baking bread. Animal dung. Fish drying beneath sunlight. Sweat. Smoke. Mud after irrigation water spilled across narrow paths. Children moved through the crowded roads carrying baskets or jars almost too heavy for their thin arms. Everywhere, labor continued. And yet even inside busy cities, social silence still mattered deeply. People understood hierarchy clearly. A servant did not speak to an official carelessly. An apprentice did not interrupt a master craftsman. A child did not question elders openly before others. Respect often appeared through restraint. A calm voice suggested discipline. Controlled speech suggested wisdom. An old saying repeated among some Egyptian teachers claimed that the truly wise person spoke little. Loudness belonged to foolish people unable to control themselves. So many children grew up believing that silence itself carried dignity. In one crowded workshop near Memphis, a stone carver named Mena worked beside 3 apprentices shaping limestone blocks for a wealthy tomb owner. Dust floated constantly through shafts of sunlight entering from narrow openings high in the walls. The air smelled dry and sharp from cut stone. The apprentices worked carefully beneath Mena's watchful eyes. Chisels tapped slowly against limestone surfaces while flakes drifted onto the floor. One apprentice, still very young, studied the carved symbols with fascination. He wondered how writing could become pictures. He wondered who first decided that birds, reeds, hands, and eyes could hold meaning. Finally, after hours of silence, he quietly asked. Mena paused only briefly before answering. "Watch longer," he said softly. Then the chiseling continued. The boy lowered his eyes and obeyed. There was no cruelty in the response. Only the ancient belief that understanding arrived through patience more than questioning. The workshop settled again into rhythmic sound. Tap. 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 Outside, the heat climbed higher toward midday. By noon, Egypt often seemed wrapped in brightness so intense it blurred the horizon itself. The sun burned against rooftops and temple stones. Roads shimmered beneath waves of rising heat. Laborers wrapped linen cloth around their heads while searching for patches of shade beside walls or carts. During these heavy hours, silence returned naturally. Exhaustion quieted conversation. In fields beside the Nile, farmers paused briefly beneath date palms eating small meals of bread, onions, and dried fish. Sweat dried slowly on dusty skin while insects hummed lazily through reeds nearby. Nobody wasted energy speaking too much. The heat pressed against lungs and muscles alike. Even animals became subdued beneath the afternoon sun. Oxen stood motionless beside irrigation canals. Dogs rested in narrow shadows. Donkeys lowered their heads wearily beside market stalls. Across Egypt, countless ordinary people moved through the same exhausting rhythm every day. Wake before sunrise. Work beneath heat. Eat simple food. Sleep briefly. Rise again. Curiosity struggled to survive inside such routines sometimes. Not because people lacked intelligence, but because fatigue leaves little room for endless wondering. A mother carrying water jars across long distances beneath the sun thought mostly about reaching home before dark. A laborer hauling stone blocks thought about aching shoulders and blistered hands. A servant cleaning floors inside wealthy estates thought about avoiding punishment and finishing tasks before nightfall. The body demanded attention constantly. Still, curiosity never vanished completely. It simply became quieter. Hidden. Like underground water beneath dry earth. Sometimes it emerged during moments of rest. Late afternoon often brought softer moods beside the Nile. The harshest heat slowly loosened its grip. Long shadows stretched across fields and village roads. Workers returning home washed themselves in canals or river water while children played nearby. The air smelled different then. Cooler. Full of damp soil and cooking fires beginning again. In one village, an elderly grandmother sat outside her home weaving baskets from papyrus reeds while several children gathered nearby listening to her stories. She spoke slowly, her voice rough with age. She described ancient spirits said to live beneath the river. She described stars as lanterns carried across the heavens by unseen hands. One small boy interrupted softly. "Who carries the stars during the day?" The old woman smiled faintly. For a long moment she said nothing at all. The children waited quietly. Finally she answered. "Some things travel where eyes cannot follow." Then she continued weaving. The boy received no deeper explanation. Yet somehow the answer felt complete enough for the evening. This was common in ancient life. Questions often opened into mystery instead of detailed reasoning. Silence filled the spaces afterward. And people accepted those spaces more easily than many would today. As darkness approached, Egypt softened once more. Birds disappeared into palm trees. Boats returned slowly toward shore carrying nets heavy with fish or nearly empty after difficult days on the river. Smoke rose from hundreds of cooking fires across villages and cities alike. Night meals remained simple for most people. Bread, beans, lentils, onions, perhaps fish when available. Families sat closely together beneath dim oil lamps while shadows flickered across mud brick walls. Conversation stayed gentle after exhausting labor. Parents discussed tomorrow's work quietly. Children listened. Again and again, listening came before speaking. A young boy named Ka sat beside his father during one such evening meal. The room smelled of warm bread and smoke. Outside, insects sang beside irrigation ditches beyond the village walls. Ka finally gathered courage to ask something he had wondered for many months. Why do scribes never carry stones like the workers? His father chewed silently for a while before answering. Because words can build things too. The boy thought carefully about this. He wanted to ask more. How? Why? Who decided such things? But his father already looked tired. Deeply tired. Lines of labor crossed his face beneath the weak lamplight. So the boy lowered his eyes and continued eating quietly. Sometimes curiosity ended not through force, but through compassion. Children learned not to burden exhausted adults with endless questions after brutal days beneath the sun. The Nile flowed beside them all, silent and dark beneath the stars. And night settled once again across ancient Egypt. Insects moved through warm air. Temple lamps flickered behind enormous stone walls. Far out in the desert, caravans rested beside small fires while camels slept nearby beneath endless skies. Inside crowded homes, workers stretched aching bodies across woven mats. Eyes slowly closed. Breathing deepened. And somewhere in the darkness, countless quiet thoughts drifted through tired minds before sleep finally carried them away. Questions remained. But silence still held them gently. The Nile River moved slowly through the darkness long before the first birds began to sing. Its surface reflected faint silver light from the moon, broken only by soft ripples near the reeds. Along the riverbanks, boats rested against worn wooden posts. Fishing nets hung drying in the night air. Palm trees stood motionless beneath the stars, their shadows stretched long across the sleeping earth. Ancient Egypt rested quietly for a few more moments. Inside homes built from mud brick and river clay, the warmth of many sleeping bodies filled the rooms. Families lay close together on woven reed mats. Linen blankets twisted loosely around tired legs. Clay jars of water stood near walls blackened gently by years of smoke from cooking fires. A baby stirred softly in sleep. Someone coughed once in the darkness. Then silence returned again. This silence was not empty. It carried exhaustion inside it. Generations of labor rested within those quiet rooms. Farmers whose hands stayed cracked from soil and irrigation water. Stone workers whose shoulders remained sore even during sleep. Women who spent endless hours grinding grain beneath the heat of the day. Servants who moved silently through wealthy homes from sunrise until night. The ancient world depended on tired people. And tired people often became quiet people. Long before dawn, a baker named Nebet rose from sleep while most of the village still rested. He sat for a moment beside the fading coals of last night's fire. The room smelled faintly of dust, grain, and warm clay. Beside him, his youngest daughter slept curled against her mother's side. Nebet rubbed his eyes slowly. Another day waited. Always another day. He stepped outside into cool darkness carrying a clay bowl filled with prepared dough. Above him, the stars looked endless. He could hear the distant sound of river water moving softly beyond the fields. Nearby, other bakers were already awake too. The village ovens would need heating before sunrise. Bread fed nearly everyone in Egypt. Rich or poor, laborer or priest, almost every meal depended on grain. And so bakers began work while the world still slept. Nebet walked quietly through narrow paths between homes. Dust cooled beneath his sandals. A stray dog lifted its head briefly before settling back to sleep. At the oven house near the center of the village, glowing embers waited beneath ash from the previous evening. Nebet knelt slowly and began feeding small bundles of dry reeds and straw into the fire. The flames returned gradually. Orange light flickered across the walls. Soon the smell of heating clay filled the air. Another baker arrived carrying more dough. The men greeted each other softly, then continued working mostly in silence. Their hands moved automatically after years of repetition. Shape the loaves. Check the fire. Turn the bread. Wait. Repeat. The younger apprentices watched carefully nearby. One boy, perhaps 10 years old, observed the older men closely while kneading dough against a smooth stone surface dusted with flour. He wanted to ask why some bread rose better than others. He wanted to ask why wealthier households used finer grain while poorer families ate darker, rougher loaves filled with bits of husk. But the men around him worked quietly. So he worked quietly too. Outside, the eastern sky slowly began turning pale. Morning returned once more to Egypt. Birds moved through the reeds beside the river. Donkeys stirred beside wooden carts. Thin trails of smoke rose from homes across the village as families prepared for another long day beneath the sun. The world awakened slowly, almost gently. Yet beneath that softness waited endless labor again. In the fields beyond the village, farmers gathered before sunrise carrying wooden tools worn smooth by years of use. Oxen snorted clouds of breath into the cool air. Water channels glimmered faintly beneath early light. A farmer named Intaf walked beside his oldest son toward the irrigation canals. The boy had reached the age where childhood began fading into responsibility. His hands already carried small cuts from reeds and rough rope. His shoulders had begun strengthening from carrying water jars and bundles of grain. As they walked, the son stared toward the horizon where morning light spread slowly across the desert. He finally spoke. Why does the desert never change? Intaf glanced toward the endless pale dunes beyond the fertile black soil of the Nile Valley. For a moment he seemed to consider the question carefully. Then he answered quietly. It changes slowly. Nothing more. The boy waited, hoping for a larger answer. But his father had already begun examining the water levels inside the canal. The conversation ended there. This happened often in ancient Egypt. Questions rarely opened long discussions. Life moved too steadily for that. Work always waited nearby. The irrigation gates needed adjusting before the sun climbed higher. Crops required attention. Animals wandered if left unwatched. Time itself felt tied tightly to survival. So curiosity learned patience. The morning air remained pleasant only briefly. Soon the heat began returning. Sunlight spread across the valley floor, bright against fields of grain and rows of vegetables growing beside carefully managed water channels. Workers bent low over crops while sweat slowly darkened their linen clothing. The sounds of labor filled the land. Wood scraping earth. Oxen breathing heavily. Water splashing through irrigation ditches. Distant hammering from workshops nearer the city. Children moved among the adults carrying tools, gathering reeds, or chasing stubborn goats away from growing plants. Most listened more than they spoke. A young girl named Seisha worked beside her mother collecting onions from dry soil. Dirt pressed beneath her fingernails. The smell of wet earth mixed with sweat and warm air. Her mother rarely stopped moving. Pull the onions. Shake away soil. Place them into baskets. Move forward. Again and again. Seisha wanted to ask why the gods made work so endless. She wanted to ask whether rich officials ever felt tired in the same way farmers did. But she remained quiet. Her mother's breathing already sounded strained beneath the growing heat. Questions felt heavy beside exhaustion. By mid-morning, the roads connecting villages to nearby cities grew crowded. Merchants guided donkeys carrying baskets of figs, grain, fish, linen cloth, and pottery. Laborers moved in groups toward construction sites near temples and tombs. Officials traveled beneath shaded coverings while servants walked behind carrying supplies. Dust rose constantly into the warm air. The smell of animals, sweat, and baked clay lingered everywhere. Near one busy road leading toward Thebes, a caravan from farther south arrived carrying incense, ivory, and exotic woods gathered through distant trade routes. Children standing nearby watched with fascination. The travelers looked different. Their clothing carried unfamiliar patterns. Their language sounded strange. A small boy tugged gently at his older brother's arm. Where do they sleep when they travel? The older brother shrugged. Wherever the road becomes dark. The answer satisfied him for now. Children in ancient Egypt often accepted partial answers because life itself remained mysterious in many ways. Few people traveled far from their homes. Most knew only the river valley, nearby fields, and the roads connecting familiar towns. The wider world existed mostly through stories. Stories told softly at night after labor ended. Stories carried by merchants beside cooking fires. Stories whispered by sailors returning from distant ports. Inside the cities, another rhythm unfolded. Stone workshops echoed with chisels and hammer strikes. Scribes bent carefully over papyrus scrolls while reed pens scratched black ink into smooth surfaces. Priests moved through temple courtyards carrying offerings beneath painted ceilings filled with stars and sacred birds. Yet even in these crowded spaces, silence remained important. Especially around power. A servant approaching an official lowered their eyes respectfully. A junior scribe waited patiently before speaking. Temple apprentices moved quietly through sacred halls. Control of speech reflected control of the self. Many ancient Egyptian teachings praised calm behavior above cleverness. The ideal person listened carefully, avoided anger, and spoke only when necessary. This belief shaped children deeply. A child who interrupted adults too often risked appearing wild or undisciplined. So many learned to hold thoughts inward. In one scribal school beside a temple wall, rows of boys practiced copying symbols onto broken pottery shards used for exercises. The room smelled faintly of ink and dust. An instructor paced slowly between them carrying a thin reed switch, though he rarely needed to use it. The students already understood expectations clearly. Quiet focus. Careful work. No unnecessary speech. One student named Rahotep stared at a line of symbols describing the movement of stars across the night sky. He loved these lessons most. The heavens fascinated him deeply. He wondered how the stars moved with such precision every night. He wondered whether the gods truly sailed among them in invisible boats. He wondered what existed beyond the darkness overhead. Finally, unable to stop himself, he raised a cautious hand. The instructor paused beside him. Yes. How far do the stars go? The room became even quieter. Several boys glanced up from their writing. The instructor studied Rahotep for a moment before speaking. Farther than writing can reach. Then he continued walking. The answer drifted through the warm room softly. Not harsh. Not dismissive. Yet still incomplete. Rahotep lowered his eyes and returned to copying symbols carefully onto the pottery shard before him. Outside, the city shimmered beneath noon sunlight. The heat became almost overwhelming now. Stone walls radiated warmth. Narrow streets trapped heavy air thick with dust and smoke. Laborers searched constantly for shade while water sellers moved through crowded markets carrying clay jars wrapped in damp cloth. During these hours, voices naturally softened again. Heat exhausted conversation. In workshops, men focused silently on repetitive motions practiced thousands of times before. Potters shaped spinning clay beneath wet hands. Weavers pulled thread through looms inside dim rooms where the air barely moved. Metal workers hammered bronze carefully while sweat rolled down their backs. Everything required effort. Even breathing. Near the river docks, boat builders repaired wooden fishing vessels pulled halfway onto muddy banks. The smell of wet reeds, river mud, and cut wood filled the air. An old craftsman named Hapu sat cross-legged beside a damaged boat hull smoothing rough edges with a stone tool. Beside him worked a young apprentice still learning the trade. The apprentice finally spoke after hours of silence. "How do you know when the wood is strong enough?" Hapu ran his fingers slowly along the repaired surface. "You feel it?" The boy waited for more explanation. None came. So he placed his own hands carefully against the wood and tried to understand through touch alone. This was how much ancient learning happened. Not through long theories. Through repetition. Through observation. Through years beside experienced hands. And always beneath this way of life remained the quiet belief that wisdom arrived slowly. Not through endless questioning. But through patience. By late afternoon, the worst of the heat finally began easing. Long shadows stretched across the roads. Workers moved more slowly now, bodies drained from the day. Some washed themselves in the Nile while others rested briefly beneath trees before beginning the walk home. The river glowed gold beneath the lowering sun. Children laughed softly along the banks while throwing pebbles into shallow water. Women filled jars for evening meals. Fishermen untangled nets preparing again for tomorrow before darkness even arrived. Life never paused fully. Still, evening carried gentleness with it. Cooking fires returned. The smell of bread drifted through villages. Birds circled above palm trees before settling into silence for the night. A mother named Henut sat outside her home grinding grain while her two daughters braided reeds nearby into sleeping mats. The sky above them slowly deepened from gold into violet. Henut hummed softly beneath her breath. One daughter looked up suddenly. "Why do people die?" The grinding stone slowed. For a long moment only insects could be heard. Then Henut answered quietly. "So others can continue." The child frowned slightly, not fully understanding. But she asked nothing more. The stone resumed grinding. Darkness deepened gradually around them. In ancient Egypt, even difficult questions often received calm simple answers. Life and death surrounded ordinary people constantly. Illness, accidents, dangerous labor, and heat claimed lives quietly and often. People learned early that some mysteries belonged to the gods. Silence helped carry those mysteries gently. Night settled again across the Nile Valley. Oil lamps flickered behind narrow windows. The stars emerged slowly overhead. Workers stretched tired bodies across woven mats while cooler air finally moved through the villages. Far beyond the river, the desert rested beneath moonlight untouched and ancient. and inside countless homes, thoughts drifted quietly through exhausted minds before sleep arrived once more. Curiosity still lived there. Soft. Patient. Waiting beneath the silence. The moon had already crossed high above the Nile when the last voices faded from the villages. Only the quiet sounds remained now. Water brushing softly against the riverbanks. Palm leaves shifting in slow warm wind. The distant cry of a night bird somewhere beyond the fields. Ancient Egypt rested beneath darkness once again. In the narrow lanes between mud brick homes, the dust had settled after the long day. Sandals left faint marks across the earth that would disappear by morning beneath new footsteps. Clay ovens still held traces of warmth inside them. Faint smoke drifted upward through openings in rooftops and vanished into the night sky. Most people slept deeply from exhaustion. A laborer who spent the day hauling limestone near a temple construction site turned slowly on his woven mat, muscles aching even in sleep. Nearby, his wife rested beside a sleeping child with one arm stretched protectively across the little body. The room smelled of warm clay, dust, and old smoke. Outside, a donkey shifted softly beside the wall. Then stillness returned again. The night hours belonged to silence more completely than any other part of life. During the day, Egypt worked endlessly. At night, the world softened. Questions that had stayed hidden beneath labor sometimes drifted gently through tired minds before sleep arrived. A fisherman lying awake briefly beside the river wondered whether the Nile itself had a spirit listening beneath the water. A servant girl stared toward the small square window above her sleeping mat and wondered what life felt like inside the homes of wealthy officials. A young scribe replayed lessons inside his head while thinking about the stars painted across temple ceilings. Most never spoke these thoughts aloud. But they existed quietly all the same. Far to the south, near the edges of the great desert, a caravan rested beside a small fire beneath enormous skies filled with stars. The travelers had spent many days crossing harsh empty land carrying copper, incense, linen, and carved ivory between distant settlements. Their camels rested nearby with folded legs beneath them, breathing slowly in the cool desert air. The desert at night felt very different from the Nile Valley. No river sounds. No crowded villages. No barking dogs or grinding grain. Only wind. Only sand. Only silence stretching endlessly in every direction. A young caravan worker named Pentu sat awake beside the dying fire while older traders slept wrapped in blankets nearby. He watched sparks rise briefly into darkness before disappearing among the stars. He had always feared the desert when he was younger. Its emptiness frightened him. But now, after many journeys, he understood something else about it. The desert forced people inward. There was little to distract the mind. No crowded markets. No constant labor beside fields. Only long hours walking beneath the sky. And inside that silence, thoughts became louder. Pentu often wondered why some men spent their entire lives traveling roads that never truly ended. He wondered whether distant kingdoms beyond the horizon lived differently from Egypt. He wondered many things. But even here, beneath endless stars, questions usually remained private. The older traders valued endurance more than curiosity. A good caravan worker followed directions, protected supplies, watched the animals carefully, and wasted neither water nor energy. Silence meant survival here too. Before dawn, cold air settled briefly across the desert sand. The travelers wrapped blankets more tightly around themselves while the fire collapsed into glowing embers. Soon another journey would begin. Always moving. Always working. Far away beside the Nile, Egypt slowly prepared for morning once again. The first sounds arrived quietly. A rooster calling somewhere beyond the fields. A wooden door creaking open. Soft footsteps moving through narrow village paths. In one small home near Memphis, a woman named Izette rose while the stars still remained visible overhead. She sat silently for a moment beside her sleeping family before beginning the morning work she had performed nearly every day of her life. She reached for the grinding stones. The grain waited nearby in woven baskets. Soon the familiar rhythm filled the room. Stone against stone. Slow. Steady. Ancient. Her youngest son stirred awake and watched her through sleepy eyes. He had heard this sound every morning since infancy. Grinding grain before sunrise. Preparing bread before the heat arrived. Repeating the same labor day after day. The boy sat quietly while his mother worked. Finally he asked softly, "Did your mother do this too?" Izette smiled faintly without stopping the grinding motion. "Yes." "And her mother?" "Yes." The boy thought about this for a while. "How long?" Izette paused briefly. "Longer than anyone remembers." Then the grinding continued. The answer drifted through the dim room gently. In ancient Egypt, many questions ended this way. Not with exact explanations. Not with long discussions. But with soft acceptance of continuity. Things had always been this way. The river rose. The grain grew. Families worked. Children learned silence. Morning slowly brightened outside. The sky turned pale gold above the night air rested softly over the narrow water in dark shapes while fishermen prepared their boats along muddy banks still cool from the night. A thin mist floated above the river surface. The air smelled fresh for a little while before the heat returned. A father and daughter walked together carrying empty water jars toward the river. The girl moved carefully beside him, still young enough that the jar felt awkward in her small arms. She watched the fishermen closely as they untied ropes and prepared nets in near silence. "Why don't they talk?" she whispered. Her father looked toward the boats. "They are listening." "To what?" "The river." The girl stared toward the water thoughtfully. The fishermen indeed seemed deeply attentive. They watched currents, reeds, birds, and weather without needing many words between them. Years on the Nile had taught them how much could be understood through observation alone. The river always spoke quietly. A sudden change in current. Birds gathering above certain waters. Wind shifting across the surface. These things mattered. And silence helped people notice them. Across Egypt, many occupations depended on this kind of careful attention. Hunters moving through marshlands listened for hidden movement among reeds. Temple priests memorized exact ritual sequences through years of silent repetition. Builders watched stone carefully for cracks or weakness. Midwives listened to breathing and pain during difficult births inside crowded homes. Ancient life required awareness. And awareness often grew best in quietness. As the sun climbed higher, villages and cities awakened fully. Roads filled again with movement. Merchants arranged baskets of figs, dates, onions, and fish beneath woven shades. Potters opened workshop doors. Donkeys carried loads through dusty streets while children hurried between errands. The smell of Egypt returned with the morning heat. Fresh bread. River mud. Sweat. Animals. Smoke from cooking fires. Wet reeds drying beneath sunlight. Near the center of Thebes, a young apprentice named Cassa worked inside a crowded linen workshop where women and girls spun thread into cloth from flax fibers. The room remained dim despite the bright day outside. Thin shafts of sunlight entered through small openings high in the walls, catching floating dust in golden lines. Hands moved constantly. Spin. Pull. Twist. Repeat. The sound of thread sliding through fingers filled the room softly. Most workers spoke very little. The labor required concentration. Casa sat beside an older woman who had spent decades weaving cloth for temple households and wealthy officials. Her hands moved so smoothly they almost seemed separate from the rest of her body. Casa finally asked quietly, "How do you remember every pattern?" The older woman smiled without looking up. "Your hands remember before your mind does." Again the answer carried simplicity. No lecture. No detailed instruction. Only another invitation toward patience and repetition. The workshop settled back into quiet rhythm. Outside, the heat intensified steadily. By midday, sunlight covered the city like burning metal. Stone roads shimmered. Market sellers wiped sweat from their necks with linen cloth. Dogs searched for shade beneath carts and stairways. Inside homes, women prepared the midday meal while children rested briefly from chores. In one narrow house beside a crowded alley, an elderly grandfather sat near the doorway repairing a fishing net while two grandchildren listened nearby. The old man's fingers moved slowly now with age. Not weak. Just careful. The younger child pointed toward the sky visible through the doorway. "Where does the sun go at night?" The grandfather tied another knot before answering. "It travels beneath the world." "How?" The old man paused. Then he shrugged gently. "No man walks beside the sun long enough to know." The children accepted this easily. Mystery belonged naturally to their world. Not every question demanded certainty. In fact, uncertainty often felt normal. The Nile flooded because the gods willed it. The stars moved according to sacred order. Death arrived when it arrived. People worked, rested, married, aged, and disappeared into the earth generation after generation. Life felt ancient even to those living inside it. And silence allowed people to live beside uncertainty without fear. During the hottest hours of afternoon, even the cities quieted somewhat. Markets slowed. Workers rested briefly against walls or beneath palm trees. The air itself felt heavy. A laborer carrying bricks near a temple stopped beside a water cellar and drank deeply from a clay cup while sweat rolled down his face. Nearby, younger workers sat silently in the narrow strip of shade cast by the temple wall. One finally spoke. "Do you think the kings ever feel this heat?" Several men laughed softly beneath their exhaustion. An older laborer answered first. "Everyone feels the sun." Then silence returned again. The men leaned back against the stone wall, eyes half closed from fatigue. Questions rose sometimes during exhaustion like this. Small quiet questions about fairness, power, and suffering. But ancient life rarely encouraged people to chase such thoughts too far. The workday continued regardless. And survival required steady hands more than restless minds. By late afternoon, shadows stretched longer across the Nile Valley once more. The worst heat faded slowly. Farmers returned from fields carrying tools across tired shoulders. Fishermen repaired nets beside the riverbanks. Women washed clothing in shallow water while children splashed nearby laughing softly. Evening always brought relief. Not complete rest, but relief. The air cooled slightly. The sky softened into gold and rose-colored light. Birds circled above the reeds before settling for the night. A young mother named Merit sat outside her home braiding her daughter's hair while nearby cooking fires filled the village with the smell of roasting fish and fresh bread. The child looked toward the western horizon glowing softly beyond the palm trees. "Why is the sky different every evening?" Merritt smiled faintly. Because the world grows tired too. The answer lingered gently between them. In ancient Egypt, answers often sounded more like poetry than explanation. Not because people lacked intelligence, but because life itself felt deeply connected to rhythm, feeling, and sacred order. The world was not something to conquer or fully explain. It was something to live within carefully. Something ancient. Something enduring. Darkness slowly returned across the Nile. One by one, lamps flickered inside homes. The stars emerged above the river again. And as workers stretched aching bodies across woven mats beside sleeping families, silence settled gently over Egypt once more. Curiosity still breathed quietly beneath that silence. But night held it softly, like the river holding moonlight in its slow black water. The Nile carried the night gently southward beneath the stars. Its dark surface moved with calm patience, slipping past sleeping villages, temple walls, reeds, fishing boats, and fields waiting for sunrise. Along the riverbanks, frogs called softly from wet mud while insects drifted above still water glowing faintly beneath moonlight. The world felt slower at night in ancient Egypt. Not empty. Not lifeless. Only softened. The heat loosened its grip for a few precious hours. Stone walls released the warmth stored during the long day. Cool air wandered through narrow streets between homes built close together from mud and straw. Inside those homes, families slept deeply from exhaustion. A woman who spent all day carrying water jars now rested beside her children, arms heavy with fatigue. A fisherman whose hands still smelled faintly of river reeds lay motionless beside rolled nets drying near the doorway. An old stone worker slept with swollen joints curled beneath a thin linen cloth. Night covered everyone equally. The rich rested. The poor rested. Servants. Farmers. Scribes. Boatmen. Temple singers. Children. And within the darkness, silence stretched across Egypt like another river flowing beside the Nile itself. In one small village north of Thebes, a boy named Meanwhile woke suddenly before dawn. For a moment he did not know why. The room remained dark except for faint moonlight entering through a small window opening high in the wall. Beside him, his younger brother slept curled tightly beneath a blanket. Meanwhile listened carefully. Somewhere outside, he could hear soft footsteps. Then came the distant sound of grain grinding. His mother was already awake. He lay quietly for a while longer, listening to the familiar rhythm. Stone against stone. Slow. Steady. Ancient. The sound seemed older than memory itself. Eventually he rose and stepped carefully across the cool floor so he would not wake the others. Outside, the village still slept beneath fading stars. The air smelled faintly of smoke, river water, and damp earth. His mother sat beside the grinding stones wrapped in a simple linen garment, moving patiently through the morning labor. She smiled faintly when she noticed him awake. "You should still be sleeping." Meanwhile sat nearby anyway. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The boy watched her hands instead. Rough hands. Strong hands. Hands shaped by years of work repeated every morning before sunrise. Finally he asked softly, "Do you ever get tired of doing the same thing?" The grinding slowed slightly. His mother looked toward the doorway where the first pale light of dawn had begun appearing beyond the fields. "Yes," she said quietly. The boy waited. But no further explanation came. The grinding resumed. Stone against stone. Meanwhile lowered his eyes and listened again. In ancient Egypt, even honest answers often arrived gently, without long reflection. Life left little space for endless discussion. Morning tasks waited. Bread needed preparing. Water needed carrying. The family would wake soon. And so silence returned naturally between them. Farther downriver, fishermen prepared once again to leave before sunrise. Mist drifted low above the Nile while boats pushed quietly away from muddy banks. Wooden oars dipped into dark water with slow, careful movements. The world remained wrapped in blue-gray shadows before the sun arrived. An older fisherman named Nak traveled beside two younger boys learning the river. Neither child spoke much. The older boy watched the currents carefully while the younger stared toward distant temple towers barely visible through morning haze. Nak finally pointed toward a cluster of birds circling low above the water. "There," he said softly. The boys understood immediately. Fish gathered beneath the birds. No long explanation was necessary. Over years beside the river, children learned to notice small signs. Water movement. Bird behavior. Wind direction. The shape of clouds before storms. Silence sharpened attention. Too many words distracted from observation. The boat drifted farther into the current while the eastern sky slowly brightened into pale gold. Along the shore, other workers already moved through the early morning light. Farmers carried tools toward irrigation canals. Women balanced jars against their hips while walking narrow paths between fields. Bakers fed reeds into clay ovens glowing brighter as flames strengthened. The smells of morning spread across Egypt. Fresh dough heating inside ovens. Wet mud near the canals. Smoke rising from cooking fires. Palm leaves warmed by the first sunlight. The world awakened gradually into another day of labor. In the city of Memphis, crowded streets slowly filled with movement beneath growing heat. Merchants uncovered baskets of dates and figs. Potters arranged fresh clay vessels outside their workshops. Scribes entered government buildings carrying papyrus rolls beneath their arms. A young servant girl named Hanotyre swept dust from the stone floor of a wealthy household courtyard while servants around her prepared the morning meal. The house belonged to an important official connected to the royal administration. Inside, painted walls displayed scenes of gardens, birds, and sacred symbols. Decorative pools reflected sunlight beneath carefully trimmed palms. Yet even here, among beauty and comfort, silence remained important. Servants moved quietly. Eyes lowered. Voices controlled. Hanotyre had learned quickly after entering service years earlier. A careless word could bring anger. An interruption could embarrass a superior. The safest servant was often the quietest one. As she swept the courtyard, she listened to older servants discussing taxes collected from nearby farming villages. She did not fully understand the numbers. But she understood enough to know that grain from tired farmers eventually filled the storage rooms of people who never worked the fields themselves. The thought lingered briefly inside her mind. Then she pushed it away and continued sweeping. Questions like these rarely led anywhere useful. The day's work always remained more immediate. Inside the household kitchen, cooks prepared bread, onions, herbs, and fish for the morning meal. The air felt thick already from oven heat and smoke. Clay pots simmered above small fires while flies drifted lazily near baskets of grain. An older cook named Benarab supervised several younger helpers with calm, tired authority. One apprentice accidentally dropped a clay bowl onto the floor where it shattered loudly. The room fell silent. The young helper froze immediately. Benarab looked at the broken pieces scattered across the stone. Then she sighed quietly. "Clean it carefully. Nothing more. No shouting. No long lecture." The girl nodded quickly and knelt to gather the fragments. Around her, the kitchen resumed its rhythm. Ancient Egypt valued restraint in many parts of life. Anger disturbed harmony. Loudness suggested loss of self-control. Even correction often arrived calmly when possible. At least among those who possessed enough power to remain calm. Outside the city walls, laborers worked beneath the growing strength of the sun. Near a temple construction site west of the Nile, teams of workers hauled limestone blocks along wooden sleds across packed earth roads. Sweat darkened their linen garments almost immediately. Sand clung to damp skin. Overseers watched the pace carefully while water carriers moved among the men offering brief relief. The work demanded rhythm. Pull. Step. Pull again. Voices rose only when necessary to coordinate movement. Otherwise most workers conserved breath and strength. A young laborer named Passer strained beside older men whose bodies had spent decades beneath this kind of labor. Their shoulders carried scars from ropes and stone. Their hands looked thick and rough like weathered wood. Passer admired their endurance. He also feared becoming like them. Bent. Exhausted. Silent. During a brief rest beside the partially completed temple wall, he asked an older worker, "Did you always know you would do this work?" The man drank slowly from a clay cup before answering. "My father did it." Then he handed the cup back. The conversation ended there. Passer stared toward the enormous unfinished columns rising against the bright sky. Stone dust drifted through sunlight like pale smoke. He wondered whether his own children would someday pull these same ropes beneath the same burning sun. The thought settled heavily inside him. But soon the overseer called the workers back into motion again. And the question disappeared beneath labor. By midday, Egypt shimmered beneath overwhelming heat once more. The Nile reflected blinding sunlight across the valley. Roads emptied slightly as travelers searched for shade. Dogs slept beneath carts while donkeys stood motionless beside walls radiating warmth. Inside workshops, movement slowed. In a pottery workshop near Thebes, spinning wheels turned lazily while clay vessels dried in rows along the walls. The smell of wet earth mixed with kill smoke hanging heavily in the air. A potter named User shaped a water jar with practiced hands while his daughter watched nearby. She loved watching the clay rise beneath his fingers. It seemed magical to her somehow. "How does the clay know what shape to become?" she asked softly. User smiled faintly without looking up from the wheel. "It listens." The girl frowned slightly. "To you. To patience." The wheel continued spinning slowly beneath his hands. The daughter watched carefully, trying to understand. In ancient Egypt, learning often unfolded through images and feeling rather than direct explanation. A teacher rarely separated craft from attitude. Patience mattered as much as technique. Calmness mattered as much as strength. The shape of a person's spirit seemed connected to the shape of their work. And silence helped cultivate that spirit. Afternoon drifted slowly onward. The heat pressed heavily against every wall, field, and body in the Nile Valley. Near the river, washerwomen beat linen cloth against smooth stones beside shallow water while children played nearby chasing dragonflies through reeds. A woman named Tadukapa paused briefly from washing and stared across the Nile toward distant desert cliffs glowing pale beneath the sun. Her young son noticed. "What are you looking at?" "The cliffs." "Why?" She shrugged softly. "They have been there longer than kings." The boy followed her gaze toward the silent stone hills rising beyond the river. Ancient. Unmoving. Watching generations pass. The thought comforted her somehow. In a world shaped by endless labor and uncertainty, permanence felt sacred. The cliffs remained. The river returned each season. The stars crossed the sky unchanged. And silence lived patiently beneath it all. As evening finally approached, shadows stretched once more across the land. Workers returned slowly toward villages and cities carrying tools, baskets, nets, and aching exhaustion home with them. The sky softened into warm gold above the Nile while cooking fires awakened across Egypt again. The smell of bread drifted through narrow streets. Voices returned gently after the long quiet wait of labor. Children gathered beside elders listening to old stories while darkness slowly deepened around them. And somewhere inside countless tired minds, curiosity still flickered softly like distant lamplight. Never gone. Only quieter than the ancient silence surrounding it. Evening settled slowly over the Nile Valley like a soft linen cloth lowered across the earth. The heat of the day remained trapped inside stone walls and dusty roads for a while longer, but the sharp brightness had faded now. Golden light rested gently on temple columns, fishing boats, palm leaves, and mud brick homes standing close together beside narrow village paths. Workers returned home in slow tired groups. Sandals scraped softly against dry ground. Wooden tools rested across aching shoulders. Linen garments clung to skin still damp from labor beneath the sun. Some people stopped beside the river before entering their homes, washing dust from arms and faces while the Nile moved quietly beside them. The river looked calm at this hour. Almost sleepy itself. Birds drifted low above the reeds searching for places to settle through the night. Insects hovered over the water. Farther away, the western desert cliffs glowed faint orange beneath the lowering sun. An old fisherman named Kai sat near the shore repairing a torn section of net while his grandson watched nearby. The old man's fingers moved slowly now. Age had stiffened his hands. Still, the knots remained perfect. The boy studied every motion carefully. Finally he asked, "How do you know where the fish will go?" Kai smiled without lifting his eyes from the net. "They follow quiet water." The child looked out across the Nile thoughtfully. The surface appeared peaceful from shore, but he knew currents moved underneath. His grandfather had taught him that the river carried hidden motion everywhere beneath its calm appearance. The boy wondered if people were the same. He nearly asked. But the old man already looked far away in thought, listening to the evening sounds around them. So the child stayed quiet too. The net repair continued beneath the fading light. Across the village, cooking fires brightened one by one. The smell of lentils, onions, fresh bread, and roasting fish drifted through the warm evening air. Women prepared meals while children carried water jars from the river or gathered dry reeds for tomorrow's fires. Inside one small home near the edge of the village, a mother named Citra kneaded dough beside a low clay oven glowing softly with heat. Her youngest daughter sat nearby sorting dates into woven baskets. The room felt warm and dim. Shadows flickered against the walls whenever the fire moved. Outside, voices drifted faintly through the narrow streets. The child looked toward the doorway. "Why does everyone work all the time?" Citra paused briefly, hands still pressed into the dough. The question seemed to settle quietly inside the room. Then she answered gently. "Because tomorrow comes every morning." The girl nodded slowly though she did not fully understand. Still, the answer felt true somehow. Tomorrow always came. Fields needed tending. Boats needed repairing. Bread needed baking. Life moved in circles that never fully stopped. The dough pressed softly beneath Citra's hands again while the evening deepened outside. Farther north, in the crowded city streets of Memphis, merchants slowly packed away their goods beneath fading daylight. Market noise softened gradually. Baskets emptied. Animals were led home. Dust settled across stone roads still warm from the day's heat. A linen seller named Nabra closed the shutters of his stall while his teenage son counted small copper weights beside him. The boy worked carefully but looked distracted. Nabra noticed immediately. "You are somewhere else in your thoughts." The son hesitated before speaking. "I was wondering what lies beyond the sea." Nabra tied a bundle of folded cloth slowly before answering. "More roads." The boy waited for further explanation. None came. A few moments later, Nabra added quietly, "Every place has work waiting." The market around them continued dimming into evening shadows. The sun looked toward the distant western sky beyond the rooftops where the last sunlight faded behind the desert. He imagined ships crossing enormous waters toward unknown cities. He imagined strange languages and unfamiliar stars. Yet even those thoughts carried a certain heaviness. Because deep down, he suspected his father might be right. Perhaps every road eventually led back to labor. Back to routine. Back to the quiet endurance shaping ordinary life everywhere. Near the great temples of Thebes, evening rituals began beneath towering stone walls covered in sacred carvings. Priests moved through shadowed halls carrying oil lamps whose flames trembled gently in the darkened air. The smell of incense drifted upward toward painted ceilings filled with stars and images of the gods. Temple spaces always seemed quieter than the outside world. Even footsteps sounded careful there. A young temple apprentice named Jehudi followed an older priest through a narrow corridor lined with stone columns. The apprentice carried a tray of small offerings while trying not to spill the oil lamp balanced beside them. The older priest stopped suddenly near an open courtyard where moonlight had begun touching the stone floor. For a while neither spoke. The silence itself felt important somehow. Finally Jehudi whispered, "Why do the gods love silence?" The priest looked toward the moonlit courtyard. "Because silence allows listening." "To what?" The priest smiled faintly. "That depends on the person." Then he continued walking. Jehudi followed quietly behind him. The answer stayed inside his mind long after the ritual ended. In ancient Egypt, wisdom often arrived this way. Not through certainty, but through calm unfinished thoughts carried quietly through the years. Outside the temple walls, ordinary life continued beneath the darkening sky. Workers rested outside their homes after the evening meal while cooler air slowly moved through the villages. Some repaired tools beneath oil lamps. Others sat silently beside family members listening to insects and distant river sounds. People did not always need conversation to feel connected. Shared exhaustion created its own closeness. A farmer sitting beside his brother after 12 hours in the fields understood silence differently from a wealthy official surrounded by servants and shaded rooms. For laborers, silence often meant rest. Relief from commands. Relief from heat. Relief from effort. An elderly farmer named Hori leaned against the outer wall of his home watching stars emerge above the Nile. His grandson sat nearby chewing slowly on a piece of bread saved from the evening meal. After a long quiet moment, the boy asked, "Were things different when you were young?" Hori laughed softly under his breath. "The river was the same." The child smiled faintly. That answer felt comforting somehow. The Nile remained. The stars remained. The seasons returned again and again. Perhaps that steadiness mattered more than change. Night deepened across Egypt. The moon climbed higher. Boats tied along the riverbanks rocked gently against wooden posts while frogs called from the reeds. Palm shadows stretched dark across sleeping roads. Inside crowded homes, families prepared for sleep. Mats were unrolled. Oil lamps dimmed. Clay jars were covered for the night. Children settled beside parents and grandparents beneath thin linen cloths while warm air drifted through small windows cut into thick mud brick walls. A young boy named Painfer lay awake beside his older brother listening to sounds outside the house. Somewhere nearby, someone still ground grain for tomorrow. A baby cried briefly in another home. Farther away, dogs barked once near the edge of the village before falling silent again. Painfer stared upward into darkness. "Are you asleep?" he whispered to his brother. No. After another pause, Painfer spoke again. "Do you think the stars ever sleep?" His brother considered this seriously. "I think they watch." "For what?" The older boy shrugged beneath the blanket. "Everything." The younger child fell quiet. Above them, faint moonlight touched the ceiling beams darkened by years of smoke. The stars continued crossing slowly overhead unseen beyond the roof. For ancient Egyptians, the night sky carried deep meaning. The heavens felt alive with movement, memory, gods, and order. Priests studied stars carefully to track seasons and ceremonies. Sailors used them for travel. Farmers trusted them as signs of time itself. Yet ordinary people mostly experienced the sky through feeling rather than study. The stars comforted them. The stars endured. No matter how difficult life became beneath the sun, night eventually arrived carrying cool air and familiar lights above the earth. Far south along the Nile, a group of stone quarry workers rested beside temporary shelters built near the cliffs where they labored far from home. The men had spent the day cutting massive stone blocks from the mountainside beneath crushing heat and swirling dust. Now they sat quietly around a small fire eating bread dipped in oil while darkness gathered across the desert. One younger worker finally asked the oldest man among them, "Why do kings build things so large?" The old worker stared into the fire for a long time before answering. "So they will not feel forgotten." The younger men grew silent. Wind moved softly through the nearby cliffs. Somewhere in the darkness, a night bird cried out once before fading into silence again. The fire crackled quietly. The younger worker thought about the enormous temples and tombs rising slowly from stone across Egypt. Thousands of laborers spent entire lives building monuments they would never own, never rule, and perhaps barely understand. Yet still the work continued generation after generation. Because kings desired permanence. And ordinary people needed food. The old worker tore another piece of bread slowly. Then he added softly, almost to himself, "But even stone becomes sand someday." No one answered. The men listened to the wind moving through the darkness around them. Night carried a strange honesty sometimes. Questions hidden during the day occasionally rose beside firelight after labor ended. Still, even then, silence remained stronger. The fire slowly burned lower. Across Egypt, countless tired bodies drifted toward sleep while the Nile flowed steadily through the darkness beside them. Curiosity still existed in those quiet minds. Small questions. Ancient questions. Questions about labor, gods, stars, death, time, and the endless returning rhythm of life itself. But silence wrapped around those thoughts gently. Like cool night air settling over warm desert stone. Before sunrise, the Nile Valley existed in a world of blue shadows and soft breathing. The stars had not fully disappeared yet. A pale gray light rested low along the horizon beyond the eastern desert, but the villages still belonged mostly to night. Palm trees stood dark and still beside the river. Boats drifted quietly against their ropes. Mist hovered over the water in long silent bands. Inside the homes of workers and farmers, sleep slowly loosened its hold. A woman turned carefully beneath a linen cloth so she would not wake the child sleeping beside her. An elderly man coughed softly near a doorway where cooler air passed through cracks in the wall. Somewhere farther down the narrow village paths, the faint sound of someone feeding reeds into a cooking fire drifted through the darkness. Then came the grinding stones again. Always the grinding stones. Slow and patient. The sound carried from one house to another across the sleeping settlement like an ancient heartbeat. Stone against stone. Grain becoming flour. Flour becoming bread. Bread becoming another day of strength. A young boy named Kua sat awake listening to the sound while his father still slept nearby after returning late from canal work the previous evening. The boy liked these quiet hours before dawn. The world felt softer then. Less demanding. Questions seemed easier to hold during darkness. During the day, labor pushed thoughts aside. But before sunrise, the mind wandered more freely. He slipped outside into the cool air. The ground felt smooth beneath his bare feet. Above him, the stars slowly faded one by one as dawn approached. He could smell smoke beginning to rise from cooking fires across the village. Near the center of the settlement, an old woman already sat outside her home shaping dough into small flat loaves beside a clay oven. Kua watched silently for a while before speaking. "Do you ever wish mornings would stay quiet forever?" The old woman smiled gently without looking up from the dough. "No, why not?" "Because quiet only feels good after hard work." The boy thought carefully about this. He had never considered silence that way before. Not as something separate from labor, but as something earned by it. The old woman pressed another loaf carefully against the warm inner wall of the oven while sparks drifted upward into the pale morning air. Soon the village would awaken fully. Soon voices, footsteps, animals, tools, and endless tasks would return. But for a few more moments, Egypt remained half asleep. Farther south along the Nile, fishermen guided narrow boats through the mist before sunrise. The river looked endless beneath the fading stars. Reeds brushed softly against wooden hulls while oars slipped quietly into dark water. Fish disturbed the surface now and then with small circles that vanished almost immediately. An experienced fisherman named Inteb traveled with his younger nephew beside him. The boy watched the older man closely. Inteb rarely wasted movement. Every motion seemed calm, measured. Even tying rope appeared effortless after so many years on the river. Finally the boy asked softly, "How do you stay so patient all the time?" Inteb looked toward the slow current. "The river is patient first." Then he pointed toward a drifting patch of reeds caught in the current. "Watch the water long enough and you stop fighting it." The nephew nodded, though he only partly understood. Still, the answer settled inside him quietly. Many lessons in ancient Egypt worked this way. Understanding arrived slowly over years rather than all at once. People learned by carrying small pieces of wisdom through ordinary life until meaning deepened naturally. The sun finally began rising above the eastern horizon. Gold light spread gradually across the Nile Valley. Temple walls glowed softly. Palm leaves brightened. Birds lifted from the reeds in dark moving clouds. The day began again. Farmers walked toward the fields carrying wooden hoes and baskets. Water carriers balanced clay jars against their hips. Donkeys moved slowly beneath heavy loads of grain or reeds. The smell of warm earth returned as sunlight touched the fields beside the river. A farmer named Bedtime worked alongside his two sons repairing a damaged irrigation canal wall weakened during the last flood season. Mud clung heavily to their legs. The younger son struggled with the work. The wall kept collapsing where he packed the wet soil. Frustrated, he sighed loudly. Bedtime glanced at him calmly. "The mud listens to your hands." The boy frowned. It doesn't listen. It does. How? The father pressed fresh mud slowly into place. If your mind fights the work, your hands fight too. The canal water moved quietly beside them. The younger boy tried again. This time he slowed his movements. The wall held a little better. Padiamun nodded once and continued working. Silence returned between them except for splashing water and distant bird calls. In ancient Egypt, labor itself often became a form of teaching. Patience, restraint, and observation mattered as much as strength. Children absorbed these lessons daily beside parents and older workers. Curiosity still existed, but it learned to move gently within the rhythm of work instead of interrupting it. Near Memphis, crowded streets filled steadily as the morning advanced. Market stalls opened beneath woven shades. Bronze workers hammered metal inside smoky workshops. Potters carried fresh clay vessels toward drying racks while scribes hurried through the roads carrying papyrus rolls beneath their arms. Dust already floated through the warming air. A young apprentice scribe named Menkhepher stood outside a government building watching officials arrive in fine linen garments carried on litters by servants. He admired the scribes deeply. Their clean hands. Their calm voices. Their lives spent indoors beside writing rather than beneath fields or stone. His teacher approached quietly beside him. "You are staring again." Menkhepher lowered his eyes respectfully. "I was wondering why scribes speak so softly." The teacher adjusted the papyrus bundle beneath his arm. "Because loud words escape too easily." The boy thought about this while following the older man inside. The scribal school smelled faintly of ink, dust, and warm stone. Students already sat cross-legged on woven mats copying symbols carefully onto pottery shards used for practice. The room remained almost silent except for scratching reed pens. Menkhepher settled into place beside the others. As he copied lines describing sacred rituals and tax records, his mind drifted briefly back to the teacher's words. Loud words escape too easily. Perhaps silence protected thoughts. Protected mistakes. Protected dignity. The idea stayed with him throughout the day. Outside, the heat climbed steadily toward midday. The Nile reflected bright sunlight across the valley while roads shimmered beneath waves of warmth. Laborers wrapped cloth around their heads and necks. Animals slowed beneath the growing heat. In a stone workshop near Thebes, men carved limestone blocks for a tomb chapel belonging to a wealthy official. The workshop echoed with rhythmic tapping sounds. Tap. 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 Stone dust drifted through shafts of sunlight entering from narrow openings high above. An older carver named Hui worked beside a younger apprentice shaping the face of a carved figure. The apprentice hesitated often, afraid of damaging the stone. Finally he whispered, "What if I ruin it?" Hui continued carving calmly. "Then you begin again." "But the stone is expensive." "So is fear." The apprentice looked uncertain. Hui finally paused and glanced toward him. "The stone remembers hesitation." Then he returned to work. The younger man stared at his own unfinished carving. Slowly, carefully, he resumed shaping the limestone. Outside the workshop, midday pressed heavily across Egypt. Workers searched for shade whenever possible. Water sellers moved through streets carrying clay jars wrapped in wet cloth. Temple courtyards emptied slightly during the hottest hours while even birds disappeared into the palms beside the river. Silence deepened naturally beneath the heat. Not because people were ordered to remain quiet. Because exhaustion softened everything. Near the edge of one farming village, an elderly woman rested beneath a date palm after carrying water from the Nile. Her granddaughter sat nearby weaving reeds into a sleeping mat. The child suddenly asked, "Why do old people sit quietly so much?" The grandmother smiled faintly. "When you live long enough, you stop needing every thought to become words." The girl continued weaving while considering this answer carefully. Wind moved softly through the palm leaves overhead. Far away, someone called to a donkey along the road. Then quiet returned again. As afternoon slowly passed, shadows began stretching longer across the fields and roads. The worst heat loosened its grip. Workers straightened aching backs and prepared for the walk home. Boats drifted back toward shore carrying fish, reeds, or bundles of goods traded along the river. The evening sky softened into gold once more. A young mother named Tabari sat beside the Nile washing dust from her son's hair after a long day helping in the fields. The boy looked tired. Very tired. Yet his mind still wandered with questions. "Do the gods get tired too?" he asked softly. Tabari poured river water gently over his head before answering. "I think even the gods rest at night." The child seemed comforted by this. He stared across the river where the western desert cliffs glowed beneath the lowering sun. Everything looked calm from here. The water. The reeds. The boats drifting slowly home. It felt impossible that tomorrow's labor already waited just beyond the coming darkness. Night returned gradually across ancient Egypt. Cooking fires brightened the villages again. Bread baked inside clay ovens while smoke drifted upward into darkening skies. Families gathered for simple meals after the long day. Inside one crowded home, an old grandfather told stories beside a flickering oil lamp while children listened sleepily. He described the first flood of the Nile. The first stars. The first kings. His voice moved slowly like the river itself. One small child interrupted softly. "How do you know these stories are true?" The old man looked toward the lamp flame for a long moment before answering. "Because people kept carrying them." The child accepted this quietly. Outside, insects sang beside irrigation canals while the stars emerged overhead once more. And across the Nile Valley, silence settled gently over tired homes, weary workers, sleeping animals, cooling stone, and flowing black water. Curiosity still drifted through the darkness in small quiet thoughts. But ancient Egypt remained a world where silence arrived first. The stars above the Nile seemed especially clear during the deepest hours of night. Without clouds, the sky stretched endlessly over Egypt like dark polished stone scattered with pale fire. The river reflected faint pieces of that light as it moved slowly between sleeping fields and silent temple walls. Most people never stayed awake long enough to see the stars at their brightest. Exhaustion carried them into sleep early. But some remained awake. Night guards beside storehouses. Boatmen traveling by moonlight. Temple priests keeping sacred rituals through the dark hours. Mothers calming restless children. And old people whose bodies no longer rested easily. An elderly woman named Nofret sat outside her home wrapped in a thin linen shawl while warm night wind moved softly through the village. She liked the quiet after midnight. No grinding stones. No shouting from market roads. No hammering from workshops. Only insects singing beside the irrigation canals and the distant sound of the Nile moving through darkness. Her granddaughter slept inside beside the others, but Nofret remained awake watching the stars slowly cross overhead. As she sat there, she remembered the many years already behind her. Flood seasons. Drought years. Funerals. Births. Long days beneath terrible heat. The faces of people now gone. Life had moved so steadily that entire decades sometimes felt like a single season. And through it all, silence had remained. Not loneliness. Not emptiness. Just quiet endurance. A donkey shifted nearby beside a wooden cart. Palm leaves brushed gently together above the road. Nofret closed her eyes for a moment and listened. Ancient Egypt often sounded softest at night. Before dawn, the first workers slowly began waking once again. The cycle never stopped. In one riverside village, a young girl named Tamarit rose beside her mother while the stars still shone faintly above the fields. The room smelled of dust, grain, and old smoke trapped within the mud brick walls. Her mother lit a small oil lamp. Orange light flickered softly across clay jars and woven baskets stacked against the wall. Without speaking, the two began preparing the morning bread. Tamarit poured grain beside the grinding stone while her mother added a little water to the dough prepared the previous evening. The familiar rhythm returned immediately. Stone against grain. Hands pressing dough. Fire crackling softly inside the oven. The girl finally whispered, "Will I always do this when I grow older?" Her mother continued shaping the dough quietly for a while before answering. "If your family needs bread, yes." The answer sounded simple. Because to ancient people, it was simple. Most lives followed the same paths as the generations before them. Children often inherited not only work, but rhythm itself. The body learned routines so deeply that entire days unfolded almost automatically. Wake before sunrise. Prepare food. Carry water. Work. Rest briefly. Sleep. Begin again. There was comfort inside repetition sometimes. But also heaviness. A quiet understanding that life moved in circles difficult to escape. Outside, dawn slowly touched the Nile Valley once more. Mist drifted above the river. Birds stirred among the reeds. The eastern desert turned pale gold beneath the rising sun. Along the riverbanks, fishermen untied ropes from wooden posts while boat builders examined hulls damaged by mud, water, and time. An older boat builder named Mini crouched beside a fishing vessel running his rough fingers along a cracked section of wood. His young apprentice watched closely nearby. The apprentice loved asking questions. More than most children. Sometimes too many. This morning he pointed toward the river and asked, "Why does the Nile never get lost?" Mini smiled softly. "Because it knows where it belongs." The boy thought about this while watching the current move southward. Then another question appeared. How do people know where they belong? Mini paused. The sounds of morning surrounded them now. Oars splashing. Birds calling. Distant voices carrying across the water. Finally the old craftsman answered quietly. Most people never ask. The apprentice fell silent. Not hurt. Only thoughtful. Mini returned to repairing the boat hull while sunlight slowly brightened the river around them. As morning spread across Egypt, villages and cities awakened fully again. Roads filled with movement. Children carried baskets nearly as large as their bodies. Farmers guided animals toward the fields. Merchants uncovered pottery, vegetables, cloth, and dried fish beneath market awnings. The smell of life returned quickly with the heat. Warm bread. River mud. Animal sweat. Smoke. Dust rising beneath sandals. Near the crowded streets of Memphis, a servant boy named Didu hurried through the market carrying folded linen for his master's household. The city overwhelmed him sometimes. Too many voices. Too many people. Too many smells mixing together beneath the growing heat. Still, he noticed things constantly. A bronze worker shaping glowing metal with careful strikes. An old woman selling figs while half asleep beside her baskets. A priest moving through the crowd in spotless white linen untouched by dust. Didu wondered about all of them. What kind of lives they lived. What they feared. Whether they felt tired all the time too. But he never asked such things aloud. Servants learned early that curiosity could become dangerous if directed toward the wrong people. So he lowered his eyes and continued walking through the crowd. Near the center of the city, scribal students already filled the school courtyard beside a temple wall. The air smelled faintly of ink and sun-warmed stone. Young boys sat cross-legged practicing symbols repeatedly on broken pottery pieces while instructors moved slowly among them. A student named Komet struggled to stay focused. His thoughts drifted constantly toward the outside world beyond the walls. Ships. Foreign lands. The desert. The stars. His teacher eventually noticed the distraction. Your mind wanders again. Komet bowed his head respectfully. Yes, teacher. The older man sat beside him for a moment. Do you know why silence matters? Komet hesitated. So we can hear instructions. The teacher smiled faintly. Partly. He pointed toward the student's unfinished writing. When the world grows quiet, the mind reveals itself. Komet looked down at the symbols he had copied unevenly across the pottery shard. The teacher continued softly. Many people fear silence because they do not wish to meet their own thoughts. Then he stood and moved away through the courtyard. The lesson stayed with Komet long after the morning ended. By midday, the familiar weight of heat settled across Egypt again. The sun burned white above the Nile. Roads shimmered. Walls radiated trapped warmth back into the air. Workers moved more slowly now, conserving strength beneath the crushing brightness. In the fields, farmers wrapped cloth around their heads while bending over irrigation canals glittering beneath sunlight. A laborer named Hapu worked knee-deep in muddy water repairing a broken canal gate with several others. Sweat ran down his face constantly. Mud clung to his arms and chest. The youngest worker among them groaned quietly from exhaustion. Hapu glanced toward him. You fight the day too much. The younger man sighed. It is too hot. Yes. Then how do you ignore it? Hapu adjusted the heavy wooden gate slowly. You do not ignore it? You continue beside it? The younger worker stared at him. Then both men returned to the work. That was often the ancient approach to hardship. Not defeating suffering. Not escaping it. Continuing beside it quietly. In a shaded weaving workshop nearby, women worked looms through the hottest hours while thin lines of sunlight entered through small openings high in the walls. Thread passed steadily through careful fingers. Wooden frames creaked softly. An older weaver named Sidamun noticed a younger girl repeatedly making mistakes in the cloth pattern. The girl looked close to tears from frustration. Sidamun touched her arm gently. The cloth feels your anger. The girl sniffed quietly. It keeps going wrong. Then slow your breathing first. The workshop remained calm around them. No one rushed. No one shouted. Outside, the brutal afternoon sun blazed over the city, but inside the shaded room the steady rhythm of weaving continued almost peacefully. By late afternoon, Egypt slowly softened again. The heat loosened. Long shadows stretched across fields and roads. Workers washed themselves beside the Nile while children splashed in shallow water nearby laughing softly. Evening birds crossed the sky above the reeds. A merchant named Painhezi rested beside the river after a long day traveling between villages with his donkey and goods. His small son sat beside him throwing pebbles into the water. After several quiet moments, the child asked, "Why is the river never tired?" Painheasy watched the current move slowly past them. Maybe it is. The child looked surprised. It doesn't look tired. The merchant smiled faintly. Many things keep moving even when they are tired. The boy stared at the water thoughtfully. Around them, evening settled gently over the Nile Valley. Cooking fires awakened. The smell of bread returned. Voices softened after the long exhausting day. Night approached once more. And with it came the ancient silence that had shaped Egypt for generations beyond counting. A silence that lived inside homes, temples, workshops, fields, boats, and weary human hearts alike. Curiosity still flickered softly beneath that silence. But always quietly. Always carefully. Like a small lamp protected from the wind. The evening breeze moved slowly through the reeds beside the Nile. It carried the smell of damp earth, river water, smoke from cooking fires, and warm stone cooling after the long day beneath the sun. Across the villages lining the riverbanks, lamps flickered softly inside small windows while darkness settled over the fields. Workers rested now. Or tried to. Bodies stretched across woven mats after hours of labor. Feet swollen from standing. Hands roughened by rope, mud, grain, clay, and stone. The ancient world demanded much from ordinary people, and night became the only true softness many of them ever knew. Inside one crowded mud brick home, a farmer named Nebuman sat quietly near the doorway after the evening meal. The room behind him glowed faintly from a small oil lamp. His wife had already fallen asleep beside their youngest child. Two older boys whispered softly nearby before slowly drifting into silence themselves. Nebuman remained awake listening to the night. The sound of insects near the irrigation canal. A dog barking far away. Water moving against the riverbank beyond the village. He often sat like this after difficult days. Not thinking exactly. Just resting inside quietness. His oldest son approached slowly and sat beside him. For a while neither spoke. Then the boy asked, "What were you afraid of when you were young?" Nebuman looked out toward the dark fields. The flood. The Nile. Yes. The boy waited. When I was small, Nebuman continued softly, I thought the river could swallow the whole world if it wished. The child imagined the enormous dark water rising higher and higher beneath storm clouds. Are you still afraid? Nebuman thought carefully before answering. No, why not? Because fear becomes heavy if you carry it too many years. The night wind moved gently through the doorway beside them. Neither spoke again for a long time. Sometimes silence itself became part of the answer. Farther north near Memphis, the city still held traces of life even late into the evening. A few market sellers packed goods by torchlight. Guards walked slowly beside government storehouses. Somewhere in the distance, music drifted faintly from a wealthy household where servants prepared a private gathering. But most ordinary people had already withdrawn into darkness and rest. A servant girl named Tentnup sat beside the rooftop edge of her master's house after finishing the day's work. Below her, narrow streets stretched through shadows and scattered torchlight. She liked rooftops at night. Up there, away from kitchens and endless instructions, the city felt quieter. Almost peaceful. She could see the Nile reflecting moonlight beyond the buildings. Boats moved slowly across the dark water carrying late travelers or goods. Tentnup often imagined leaving the city entirely someday. Traveling south along the river. Seeing distant temples carved into cliffs. Perhaps even crossing the desert roads beside caravans. But such thoughts always faded by morning. Dreams did not grind grain or carry water. Dreams did not protect tired families from hunger. and so she kept them mostly to herself. A quiet private world inside her mind. Below, someone called softly for another servant. Tentnup closed her eyes briefly before standing again. The night never lasted long enough. In the temple districts of Thebes, priests moved through evening rituals beneath towering columns painted with stars and sacred birds. The air inside the temple halls felt cooler than the streets outside. Stone floors held traces of nighttime chill while incense drifted slowly through dim corridors lit by oil lamps. A young temple assistant named Pakura carried water jars through one of the inner courtyards beneath the moonlight. The temple always made him feel small. The walls rose enormously around him, covered in carvings older than his grandparents. Kings stood frozen in stone, forever presenting offerings to silent gods. Pakura paused beside a reflecting pool where moonlight touched the still water. An older priest noticed him lingering. "You are wandering in thought again." Pakura bowed respectfully. "I was wondering if the gods ever become tired of listening to people." The priest stood beside him quietly for a moment. Then he answered, "Perhaps that is why silence pleases them." The moon reflected softly in the water between them. Pakura looked down at the ripples spreading gently across the pool. The answer felt strange, but peaceful. In ancient Egypt, silence often carried holiness because it created space. Space for prayer. Space for thought. Space for listening to something beyond ordinary life. Even ordinary workers sometimes sensed this during the quietest moments beside the river or beneath the stars. Not certainty. Not revelation. Just stillness. And stillness itself felt sacred. Before dawn, the villages awakened once more. The cycle returned faithfully. Grinding stones sounded through the darkness. Clay ovens glowed. Workers rose slowly from sleep. A woman named Miraret stepped outside her home carrying empty water jars while the stars still remained visible overhead. The ground felt cool beneath her sandals. She walked toward the Nile along a narrow path between sleeping homes where only a few lamps still burned. Ahead of her, other women moved quietly through the darkness carrying jars of their own. Nobody spoke much this early. Words felt unnecessary before sunrise. At the riverbank, Miraret knelt carefully beside the water. The Nile reflected the stars almost perfectly. For a moment she simply watched them trembling on the surface. Then her young daughter beside her whispered, "Why do stars disappear in the morning?" Miraret filled the jar slowly before answering, "They rest from watching us." The child nodded softly. Ancient people often explain the world through feeling instead of logic. The sun rested. The stars watched. The river listened. The desert waited. Everything seemed alive in some quiet, unseen way. And because of this, silence never felt completely empty. The first pale light of dawn spread across the eastern horizon. Birds stirred in the reeds. The women lifted heavy jars onto their hips and shoulders before beginning the walk home. Soon the day's labor would begin again. In a farming village farther south, a young boy named Hika followed his grandfather toward the fields shortly after sunrise. The old man walked slowly now, leaning slightly from years of labor. Still, his eyes noticed everything. Water levels. Bird movement. Cloud shapes. The health of growing grain. Hika admired this deeply. "How do you see so much?" he asked. His grandfather smiled faintly. "I stopped trying to speak over the world." The boy frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" The old man gestured toward the fields around them glowing beneath the morning sun. "Most people think while they look. Fewer people simply look." The answer settled softly into the warm morning air. Hika walked quietly after that, trying to notice more. The sound of wind moving through grain. The smell of wet soil near the canals. Dragonflies hovering above shallow water. Perhaps silence truly changed what a person could see. By midday, the heat returned heavily once more across Egypt. The sun burned against rooftops and temple walls. Workers wiped sweat from their necks while animals searched for narrow strips of shade. Near a construction site outside Thebes, laborers hauled sandstone blocks beneath the crushing brightness. One young worker named Baki struggled to keep pace with the others. His breathing grew uneven. His shoulders burned. During a short rest beside the unfinished wall, he muttered quietly, "I do not understand why life must always feel so difficult." An older laborer sitting nearby drank slowly from a clay cup before answering. "The earth is heavy." Baki looked frustrated. "That is not an answer." The old man nodded calmly. "No. It is a truth." The younger worker fell silent. Above them, the sky stretched endlessly blue without mercy. The old laborer leaned back against the warm stone wall. "Some people waste their strength asking why the sun burns," he said softly. "Others learn where the shade is." The workers soon returned to hauling stone. The conversation faded into the rhythm of labor once more. In ancient Egypt, wisdom often sounded practical rather than grand. People lived too close to exhaustion for endless philosophy. Survival shaped thought. Yet hidden beneath ordinary advice were deeper understandings about patience, endurance, and acceptance. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening again, life along the Nile relaxed slightly. Children played beside irrigation canals while women prepared the evening meal. Fishermen repaired torn nets beneath palm trees. Scribes rolled closed the day's records while dust floated golden through late sunlight. A young girl named Nejem sat beside her grandmother weaving reeds into baskets outside their home. The old woman's hands moved slowly but perfectly. Nejem watched for a while before asking, "Were you ever curious about the world when you were young?" Her grandmother laughed softly. "Of course. What happened to the curiosity?" The old woman looked toward the river where evening light shimmered across the water. It became quieter. The girl considered this carefully. "Why?" "Because life speaks loudly." The reeds rustled gently in the evening breeze. Far away, someone sang softly while returning home from the fields. The grandmother continued weaving. And above the Nile, the first stars slowly began returning once more. Night settled over Egypt again with slow familiar grace. The last light faded from the western desert cliffs until they became dark shapes resting beyond the Nile. The river itself turned black beneath the stars, though small pieces of moonlight trembled across the moving surface whenever the current shifted. Cooking fires dimmed one by one across the villages. Voices softened. Children drifted toward sleep beside tired parents. The long day finally loosened its grip on the land. Inside a small riverside home, a woman named Henut spread woven mats across the floor while her husband cleaned mud from his sandals near the doorway. Their youngest child already slept curled beside a clay water jar, breathing softly in the warm night air. Henut moved slowly from exhaustion. The day had been heavy. Grinding grain before dawn. Carrying water. Preparing meals. Washing linen beside the Nile. Watching children. Mending torn clothing near sunset. Now at last there was quiet. Her husband sat beside the doorway looking out into the darkness where insects sang near the irrigation canals. For a while neither spoke. They did not need to. After many years together, silence often felt more comforting than conversation. Finally Henut whispered, "What were you thinking about?" The man leaned his head against the wall. Nothing. She smiled faintly. Ancient people understood this kind of nothing. Not emptiness. Rest. A mind too tired to carry thoughts for a little while. Outside, the Nile continued flowing beside the sleeping world. Farther downstream near Memphis, guards carrying oil lamps walked slowly along the outer walls of government storehouses filled with grain. The city looked different at night. Cooler. Less crowded. Shadows softened the hard edges of stone buildings and narrow roads. A young guard named Pasht paused beside the riverbank while his older companion continued ahead. The Nile reflected the stars so clearly that it almost looked like another sky beneath the earth. Pasht stared quietly at the water. The older guard eventually noticed his absence and returned. "You stop too often." Pasht nodded toward the river. "Have you ever wondered how old the Nile is?" The older man shrugged. "Older than questions." Then he continued walking. Pasht followed after him through the darkness. The answer stayed inside his mind. Older than questions. There was comfort in that thought somehow. The world had existed long before any single person tried to understand it. Long before kings. Long before temples. Long before scribes carved names into stone hoping to be remembered forever. The river simply continued. Near Thebes, the great temple complexes rested beneath moonlight. Massive columns cast long shadows across silent courtyards while statues of gods and kings watched motionlessly through the night. Only a few lamps still burned inside the sacred halls. A young priest named Usermontu sat alone beside one of the inner pools after completing the evening rituals. The surface of the water remained perfectly still. He often came here after ceremonies ended. Not to pray exactly. Just to listen. Temple life surrounded him constantly with chants, incense, rules, offerings, and sacred words. Yet the quiet moments afterward felt most important somehow. He remembered something an older priest once told him during his first years in the temple. The gods already know your thoughts before you speak. At the time, Usermontu had not understood. Now he wondered if silence itself might be a form of prayer. The moon reflected softly in the water. A night breeze moved through the courtyard carrying the faint scent of lotus flowers from the river. Usermontu closed his eyes briefly. For a few moments, the entire world seemed to breathe slowly around him. Then distant footsteps echoed through the temple halls and the feeling passed gently away. Before dawn, life began again. Always again. In villages along the Nile, the first workers rose from sleep while darkness still covered the earth. A baker named Painfer stepped outside carrying bundles of dry reeds beneath one arm. The stars remained bright overhead while the village around him stayed quiet except for occasional coughs and the sound of animals shifting in sleep. He knelt beside the clay oven and fed reeds into the ashes from yesterday's fire. Soon small flames awakened. Orange light flickered across his tired face. Nearby, his young daughter sat watching silently. She often woke early just to sit beside him during these quiet hours before sunrise. Tonight she finally asked, "Do you like making bread?" Painfer thought carefully before answering. "I like feeding people." The child looked toward the warming oven. "But do you like the work?" Painfer smiled softly. "Some days." The honesty surprised her slightly. Adults rarely admitted such things openly. Most simply worked because work needed doing. The girl rested her chin against her knees. "What would you do if you never had to work again?" Painfer laughed quietly beneath his breath. "Sleep." The oven crackled warmly between them while the eastern horizon slowly began turning pale. Across Egypt, Similar mornings unfolded endlessly. Fishermen prepared boats. Farmers checked irrigation canals. Servants swept courtyards. Scribes unrolled papyrus. Children carried water jars through cool dawn air. The rhythms rarely changed. And because they changed so little, silence became woven into life naturally. People did not always need words to understand what came next. Near the edge of one farming village, a boy named Tjanfer followed his mother toward the river carrying a small clay jar nearly too heavy for him. Mist floated above the water. Birds stirred among the reeds. The world felt calm before the heat returned. As they walked, the boy suddenly asked, "Why do grown people stop asking questions?" His mother glanced at him with mild surprise. "Who says they stop? You never ask any." She adjusted the larger jar balanced against her hip. "Sometimes questions become private." The boy considered this carefully. "Why?" His mother looked out across the river where the first sunlight touched the surface gold. "Because not every question needs an answer spoken aloud." The two continued walking quietly beside the Nile. The child thought about hidden questions resting silently inside adults. Perhaps every tired face carried thoughts never shared. By midday, Egypt burned beneath the familiar weight of the sun once more. Heat shimmered above roads and rooftops. Workers wiped sweat from their eyes while flies drifted lazily through the thick air. In a crowded weaving workshop, women sat beside large wooden looms while thread moved steadily through practiced fingers. A young weaver named Istnofret struggled to focus. Her mind wandered constantly toward thoughts she never shared aloud. Why did some families remain poor forever? Why did servants bow before people no wiser than themselves? Why did life feel so repetitive? The older woman working beside her eventually noticed the distraction. "You pull the thread too tight when you think too much." Istnofret looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry." The older woman shook her head gently. "No need." The loom creaked softly between them. After a while the older woman added quietly, "Thoughts are like thread. Pull too hard and they break." Istnofret looked down at the cloth growing slowly beneath her hands. The pattern remained steady despite her wandering mind. Outside the workshop, the city groaned beneath afternoon heat. Laborers rested briefly beside walls while market sellers poured water over dusty roads hoping to cool the air. Near the river docks, sailors unloaded cargo from boats arriving from farther south. Bundles of papyrus. Clay jars of oil. Baskets of dates. Wood. Stone. Fish packed with salt. A dock worker named Horium Habe strained beneath a heavy load while another man beside him complained endlessly about the heat. Finally Horium Habe muttered softly, "The sun does not care." The other man laughed tiredly. "No. It does not." There was strange comfort in that truth. The world remained indifferent. The river flowed. The sun burned. The seasons returned. And people continued beside them. By late afternoon, shadows stretched longer across the Nile Valley again. Children splashed beside canals. Women baked evening bread. Farmers washed dust from tired bodies in the river while the sky slowly softened toward gold. An old storyteller named Ramos sat outside his home surrounded by several children waiting for the evening stories to begin. The old man's voice moved slowly and calmly through the warm air. He described ancient kings, wandering spirits, hidden tombs, sacred birds, and stars sailing across the heavens. The children listened quietly. Finally one small girl interrupted. "How do you know all these stories?" Ramos smiled. "They were given to me." "By who?" "Someone older." And who gave them to that person? The old storyteller looked toward the darkening sky where the first evening star had appeared. Someone older still. The children fell silent. The answer felt endless somehow. Like the Nile. Like time itself. The old man continued speaking softly while darkness gathered around them. And across ancient Egypt, another night approached carrying cool air, tired bodies, dim lamps, and the deep familiar silence that had shaped generations. A silence inside homes. Inside temples. Inside weary hearts. A silence that taught people to listen long before they ever learned to speak their curiosity aloud. The Nile moved through the darkness with the same calm rhythm it had carried for thousands of years. Night wrapped itself gently around the riverbanks, around the sleeping villages, around the temple towers rising quietly against the stars. The air had cooled slightly after the long heat of day. Palm leaves whispered softly whenever the wind passed through them. Somewhere far across the water, a bird called once and then became silent again. Most homes had gone dark. Oil lamps had burned low. Families rested close together beneath thin linen cloth while the sounds of breathing slowly filled the rooms. An old farmer named Jethro lay awake beside the doorway of his home listening to the night air moving through the village. Sleep came more slowly to him now. Age had changed many things. His back remained stiff from decades bending over fields. His knees ached when the weather shifted. Sometimes old memories returned during the quiet hours before dawn and refused to leave. Beside him, his grandson slept deeply after a long day carrying water and helping repair irrigation walls. Jethro watched the child for a while. Young faces looked peaceful in sleep. Untouched by years of repetition. Untouched by long disappointments. He wondered quietly what kind of man the boy would become. Whether curiosity inside him would survive adulthood. Or whether labor would slowly quiet it, just as it had quieted so many others. Outside, insects hummed beside the canals. The old farmer closed his eyes and listened. In ancient Egypt, silence was never truly empty. It carried small sounds gently inside it. Water dripping from jars. Wind against reeds. Sand shifting beneath sandals. The crackling remains of cooking fires. The distant movement of animals in the dark. People learned to notice these things because silence surrounded so much of ordinary life. Before dawn, the first workers slowly stirred awake once more. The cycle returned faithfully as always. In a village near the edge of the delta marshlands, fishermen prepared to leave while the world still rested beneath stars. A young fisherman named Mena untied ropes beside his father's boat while cool mud pressed softly beneath his bare feet. Mist floated low over the water. The reeds looked silver in the moonlight. His father climbed quietly into the boat carrying rolled nets across one shoulder. For a while they worked without speaking. Then Mena finally asked something he had wondered many times before. Did you ever want another life? The older man paused beside the boat. The question settled into the darkness between them. Finally he answered. When I was young. Mena looked surprised. What changed? His father pushed the boat gently into the water. The river became familiar. That was all. But Mena understood more than he expected. Familiarity itself could become a kind of home. Not happiness exactly. Not excitement. But steadiness. The two climbed into the boat while dawn slowly approached beyond the eastern horizon. Nearby, other fishermen moved silently through the mist like shadows drifting across the Nile. In the villages farther inland, women already ground grain beneath faint lamplight while children slept nearby. A mother named Isatnofret worked patiently beside the grinding stones while her oldest daughter watched with sleepy eyes. The room smelled warm from the clay oven heating nearby. Outside, the first rooster had begun calling. The daughter rested her head against the wall. "Do you think life will always feel the same?" Her mother continued grinding for several moments before answering. "Some parts." "Which parts?" "The tiredness." The girl laughed softly. "Is it no?" Fred smiled faintly too. Then silence returned again, along with the steady sound of stone against grain. In ancient Egypt, humor existed quietly sometimes. Small tired humor. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just simple understanding shared between people who worked hard every day. Morning spread gradually across the Nile Valley. Gold light touched temple walls and flooded fields beside the river. Birds lifted from the reeds. Smoke rose from village ovens into the warming air. The world awakened into movement again. Farmers walked narrow paths toward the canals, carrying tools across their shoulders. Servants swept courtyards clean before the heat intensified. Merchants arranged goods beneath woven awnings while donkeys waited patiently nearby. The smell of Egypt returned with the sunlight. Bread. Dust. Animals. Smoke. Wet earth. River water. Near Memphis, a young apprentice stone carver named Cassis sat outside his workshop eating a small piece of bread before the day's labor began. The city already buzzed softly around him. Hammering from distant workshops. Voices from the market roads. The creaking wheels of loaded carts. His master emerged from the workshop doorway carrying carving tools wrapped in cloth. Casa hesitated before speaking. "Master, how do you know when a carving is finished?" The older man looked toward the unfinished statues lined beside the wall. "You stop hearing what is missing." Casa frowned slightly. "What if you always hear something missing?" The master smiled gently. "Then you are listening too closely." They entered the workshop together. Inside, sunlight streamed through high openings, catching clouds of pale stone dust floating in the air. The rhythmic tapping soon began again. Tap. 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 Stone slowly surrendering to patient hands. Many crafts in ancient Egypt required silence because silence protected concentration. Carvers listened to stone. Potters watched clay carefully. Weavers followed delicate patterns. Scribes copied symbols precisely. Too much noise broke attention. Too much talking led to mistakes. And mistakes carried consequences when materials were precious and labor endless. By midday, the familiar heat settled heavily over the land once more. The sun glared above the Nile without mercy. Roads shimmered. Walls radiated warmth back into the air. Workers slowed naturally beneath the crushing brightness. In one field beside the river, a young farmer named Budhamun paused beside the irrigation canal, wiping sweat from his face with trembling hands. The work had been difficult all morning. The canal wall kept collapsing where the mud dried too quickly beneath the heat. An older farmer nearby noticed his frustration. "You fight the field." Budhamun sighed. "It refuses to stay together." The older man knelt slowly beside the broken section. "The earth remembers patience." Together they pressed fresh mud carefully into place while canal water moved quietly beside them. After a long silence, Budhamun finally asked, "Did you always understand these things?" The older farmer smiled faintly. "No, when did you learn?" The man looked out across the bright green fields stretching toward the Nile. "When I stopped rushing every answer." The younger farmer considered this quietly. Above them, dragonflies hovered over the water, shining blue in the sunlight. Near the temple districts of Thebes, Scribes sat inside shaded rooms recording grain deliveries, labor counts, and offerings brought for the gods. The room smelled of papyrus, ink, and warm stone. A young scribe named Jehudimos copied numbers carefully across a scroll while his teacher examined another document nearby. The work demanded intense focus. One misplaced symbol could create confusion later. Still, Jehudimos' thoughts wandered often. Today he found himself staring through the open doorway toward the bright courtyard outside. "What are you looking at?" the teacher asked calmly. "The sky." The older scribe waited. Jehudimos finally continued. "I was wondering if anyone truly understands why we are here." The room became very quiet. The teacher rolled his scroll closed slowly before answering. "Understanding is not always given." "Then why do people keep searching?" The older man dipped his reed pen into ink carefully. "Because silence alone can become too heavy." The answer lingered softly in the shaded room. Outside, footsteps echoed across the temple courtyard. A bird crossed briefly through the bright square of sunlight visible from the doorway. Then the work resumed again. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, Egypt exhaled beneath the fading heat. Long shadows stretched across the fields. Workers washed themselves beside the river while children chased one another through dusty paths between homes. Cooking fires awakened again. The smell of roasting fish and fresh bread drifted through the villages. An elderly woman named Tentamun sat outside weaving baskets while her granddaughter helped sort reeds beside her. The child looked thoughtful. Finally she asked, "Why do adults become quieter as they grow older?" Tentamun smiled gently without stopping her weaving. "Because they learn how much the world already says." The girl tilted her head slightly. "I don't understand." The old woman pointed toward the evening around them. The sound of birds settling in the palms. The smell of bread baking nearby. The river glowing gold beyond the reeds. "Most people speak before they listen long enough," she said softly. The child fell silent. Together they continued weaving while darkness slowly gathered across the Nile Valley. The first stars appeared overhead. Workers drifted toward sleep inside warm crowded homes. And once more, ancient Egypt settled gently into the deep familiar silence that had taught generations to observe the world quietly before asking too many questions of it. Now the night along the Nile has grown very still. The cooking fires have faded into soft red embers beside quiet homes of mud, brick and reed. The markets have emptied. The workshops have fallen silent. Even the river itself seems to move more slowly beneath the stars. Across ancient Egypt, tired workers sleep deeply after long days beneath the heavy sun. Farmers rest beside open doorways where cooler air drifts through the darkness. Fishermen sleep near rolled nets that still smell faintly of river water and reeds. Scribes lie beneath linen cloth after hours spent copying careful symbols by fading light. Children dream quietly beside warm clay walls while distant insects sing near the canals. And above them all, the stars continue their slow journey across the sky just as they always have. For countless generations, people beside the Nile learned to live within silence before they learned to speak their curiosity aloud. Silence during the early morning grinding of grain. Silence while shaping clay beneath patient hands. Silence during long walks beside irrigation canals shimmering under the sun. Silence inside temples where oil lamps flickered against stone. Silence at night beside the river when the wind moved softly through palm leaves. But beneath that silence, questions still lived quietly in the human heart. Questions about time. About labor. About the gods. About the stars reflected in dark water. Questions carried gently from parent to child, from old storyteller to listening ears, from weary worker to sleepless mind beneath the night sky. And perhaps that is why the ancient world still feels close even now. Because the people of Egypt were not so different in their quiet moments. They grew tired. They searched for peace. They wondered about the future while standing beside rivers older than memory. And after long exhausting days, they rested beneath the same stars that shine softly overhead tonight. Now the Nile continues flowing through darkness. The desert cliffs remain still beneath moonlight. Palm trees sway gently beside sleeping villages. The last lamps dim slowly one by one. And ancient Egypt drifts peacefully into silence once more. So let the river carry your thoughts away now. Let the warm night air soften everything. And rest beside the quiet waters of the Nile, where the ancient world sleeps beneath endless stars.